Hi, good afternoon to everybody. I am Dr. Clarissa Yvonne Domingo, a diplomate of the Philippine College of Swine Practitioners, and I will be moderating our second day of this uh, Pinoy Pork Challenge event. Now, as the saying goes, everything that has a beginning has an ending. When we make peace with that, all will be well. That's why second day is living with ASF, navigating through and overcoming challenges. So now we thank all of you for the 25th PPC, but the second in a virtual format. We hope you will gain much knowledge from the speakers and the interactions later. First, we thank Boringer for sponsoring the first Rodolfo Pinera tribute video. And so let's watch this tribute video.
Good afternoon, everyone. Our speaker for today is a holder of Master of Science degree in Veterinary Preventive Medicine and PhD in Veterinary Microbiology from Iowa State University. She is also a diplomate of the American College of Veterinary Preventive Medicine with experience in swine operations, research, diagnostics, and various technical roles in Boehringer Ingelheim. She is currently the advisor of the Swine Health Preparedness Working Group of the Swine Health Information Center, who protects and enhances the health of the United States swine herd. Ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome Dr. Krista Goodell for her presentation, Getting More for Less, Performance-Based Parameters. A round of applause, please.
Good afternoon. It is a privilege to be able to be speaking with you today, and I'd like to thank the organization for the invitation to the Pinoy Pork Challenge. In today's presentation, Getting More for Less, Performance-Based Parameters, I plan to discuss how we can better focus on processes and topics which add value. This includes using diagnostics and production parameters more effectively to not only improve pig performance, but to work to prevent disease or the impact of disease on our farms. When we talk about how do we approach problems to get more out of what we do, the first question is, what is our desired goal? Once we identify a goal, we will need to put in tools to monitor what we intend to measure. This is really important, and it's an important part of production because it shows us how we demonstrate improvement or reduction in variability. As we know, variability is quite costly. With that, we will then cover current industry standards on PRRS virus control and the terminology which is necessary when we're ready to address systemic PRRS issues. Finally, we will briefly cover more recent research and work that is adding tools to our toolbox to monitor with population samples as opposed to individual sampling. And since serology is currently widely used in countries outside of the US, we will discuss a more informative way to use serology and target high-risk areas of production. Targeting serologic use will add value by reducing the work and narrowing the focus of the diagnostics that are performed. I believe this audience is vast and diverse, so although there may be some basic components of today's discussion, I hope there are nuggets that everyone will take home and think about or apply. When I looked into the Philippine pork market, I was very excited to see this, and I didn't realize that the Philippines, although it's a small country, is the 10th largest pork consumer. It's the 8th top pork producer and the 7th largest pork importer. And Filipinos currently consume around, I believe, close to 17 kilograms pork per annum. The local swine industry is worth 191 billion pesos, which is equal to about 5 billion US dollars, and that pork is actually second only to rice in your agricultural output. In 2019, the pig inventory before ASF, of course, was 12.71 million, and the majority of these farms are small holdings, small operations with less than 100 animals. This does create some challenges in how we understand disease control and biosecurity, but I think the themes that we'll be talking about today should be implementable across production systems, and I hope that when you go home, these are things that can be applied to all farms that are attending. As we know, ASF entered the Philippines in July of 2019, and it was suspected through contaminated food scraps or feeding waste to domestic pigs. Since that outbreak, ASF has affected almost 3,000 villages and over 580 cities. Cases have been declining, as I've been reading, and according to Reuters, active cases actually are confined to 22 villages. So there is hope that we are on the upside of eliminating African swine fever in the Philippines. So when we talk about identifying our desired goals and how do we monitor in production, where do we focus to improve health, production, and pig performance? What is that goal in the Philippines? And I would challenge that it's to make more pigs, to make more pork and feed the country. The questions to ask are, what is negatively impacting pig performance? Is it PRRS? Is it PED? Or is it African swine fever? And why is disease able to impact pigs? Why is it present in our farms? Or how is it going to be able to get into our farms? And clearly we know that the key risk factors are animals, our sanitation, so biocontainment and bioexclusion properties of our biosecurity program. And then of course diseases can enter when we have new animal entry. And we have in these pictures different ways of animals coming into or leaving sites. And of course, the impact of sanitation and biosecurity, even at the level of feed delivery, how important that is to our farms. So I'd like to briefly talk about the epidemiologic triangle. I think it's critical to understand how does disease happen in a pig. And in all honesty, the disease is actually able to affect a pig because of three things. Because the pig is susceptible, because the environment contains the pathogen or it causes stress to allow the pig to succumb to disease, and the pathogen itself must be there and must be able to be infectious. Those are the three components of our epidemiologic triangle. But as you know, as pig producers and in the pig industry, all of this is also circled by our biosecurity. Are we able to keep pathogens out in the first place? Are we able to sanitize between our groups? Are we maintaining good health of people coming into the farms? And are people performing the right tasks, the right time, to the right pigs every day? So people in biosecurity are critically involved in the ability of our animals to stay healthy. And I'd like to keep this as part of the theme for today's discussion. And last, how can we better manage and impact health? We do it through biosecurity, through production monitoring, and through diagnostic monitoring. So what are the things that we need to monitor? The key risks we know are the environment. And again, we do that through biosecurity and monitoring our biosecurity. And our people. Of course, our people are our caregivers, and they're taking care of the sites. So those items really need to be part of a routine monitoring program for documenting the activities that we will be discussing. And of course, the animals. Here we have on the top an isolation barn, which is critical for making sure that replacement animals are able to be separated from sow farms, and there they can be tested when they enter to make sure they're free of diseases, and before they exit to again maintain that freedom from disease or to ensure that they were immunized as expected. And again, this is a boar stud on the top right as well. The boar stud carries semen, and clearly we can have all the biosecurity measures in place at a sow farm, and we want to maintain the semen at the same level. So monitoring boar studs actually happens on a daily basis in the US because we have had some issues that we've infected sow farms. And last, we have animals. The animals are a significant risk when we end up commingling them or when we're not identifying them early and disease can spread. So how can we measure? Some of the easy measurements are to observe in the farm and then document. And here we have pictures of abortions. And we actually, this should be a familiar chart for most of you. It's a farrowing rate monitor. And what you see on this farrowing rate monitor, if you can see my arrow, is that there is a target of breeds that should happen every week. And then what actually was bred, the number of sows that were bred. Across the top, we have week 1 through week 16. And what this is a visual tool to understand how many, if breeds were met, and then if the breeds actually stay, if there's fallout early, or as in this case, we see in mid-gestation, there is a beginning of a fallout and abortions, particularly in mid and late gestation, which could be an identifier of PRRS. This can be easily charted then in what this is here as a sample, an SPC chart, statistical process control chart. And we can actually chart all of our production indicators from the breeding herd, from farrowing, like pre-weaning mortality, and in our nursery grow finish. And what you are looking at is this middle line is what we expect, so our average, and then 3 standard deviations from that average. And when we chart these production parameters, it allows us to visualize when something is not right, or when there is increased variation, or when something happens outside of the norm. Silva actually published a paper back in 2017. Dr. Silva works to report in the Morrison Swine Health Monitoring Project from University of Minnesota. And they are reporting from, I think, 26 or 27 different production systems in the US. And what they wanted to understand was as they get this large amount of data, are identifying PRRS. But is it possible, and how likely is it that at the farm level, there is an even greater sensitivity or granularity to that early detection? And what they found was that if we are more efficient, they found that actually farms are more efficient if farms are monitoring the frequency of abortions, which can be done easily by making these charts and understanding the fallout early and then aggressively attending to them, having an action plan for it. Similarly, Faberjan and this is actually Maple Leaf Foods was a collaborator for this paper in 2020. I found it very interesting that they did a modeling for African swine fever detection. And what they identified was if we are monitoring mortalities in the finishing and have a systematic expectation of weekly mortality, then when you chart your weekly mortality, if you exceed your expected mortality, that is an indicator, and if you investigate it, it gives you early detection. And in their case, when they modeled it, they were able to detect African swine fever within 8 days of it being introduced into the farm. So in their case, they were monitoring for 4 pigs that had died in a room in any 7 days. And if they had exceeded 4 dead pigs, the expectation is that you investigate that death and submit tissue samples, include your veterinarian. And by having an action, because you are routinely monitoring, they did identify that there is a way to detect African swine fever earlier, which we know is part of the reason that we're having a hard time eliminating African swine fever, because the deaths are very slow at the beginning and it has a very slow transmission rate. And on the African swine fever monitoring topic, I just want to share with you a presentation slide from Dr. Clayton Johnson that he gave about 2 weeks ago at the USDA African Swine Fever Action Week webinar. And I was really impressed with the visual impact that his information had. He talked about thinking about your farm as a fortress, as a castle. And even though we know that our farms are maybe more rural and maybe don't look like a castle, I think we all can appreciate that we can put things in place to keep out what is outside of our farm, while at the same time keeping in what is inside. So our people stay inside the farm. We don't have people going between farms. We keep feed delivery, mortality removal, etc. outside the farm, and hopefully there are walls or some type of fencing in place for wild animals, etc. He talked about bioexclusion, keeping what is outside the farm outside, and making sure we have equal emphasis on all of the parts of biosecurity, not focusing overly on one side to the detriment of another. And that got into the belts and suspenders approach, which I really like that phrase, belts and suspenders. I gave you an example of replacement animals coming into an isolation unit. That unit is a physical separation from the sow farm, but we also want to have the testing, the diagnostic testing that complements the reason that we are separating those animals. So they're separated because we are bringing them in from someplace else, but we also want to confirm that they are negative to the pathogens that we don't have in our farm, or that we are exposing them and they are equally immunized. So to me, that's a good example of belts and suspenders. In whole, we need to think about good biosecurity, not just being a good plan, but a good plan with good implementation. And here was the example that Dr. Johnson shared of a great plan, but it was rather one-sided on its emphasis. And as far as the belts and suspenders, there were no suspenders. So here we have the entryway to a farm. This entryway required that people take showers. There are other locations within this farm that as soon as people moved through this entryway, there was another entryway, more showers, more downtime before they were able to get in with pigs. However, this is their feed delivery, and the feed delivery truck, although it went through the tire wash, actually delivered feed in bags. And when you see this, this is actually the driver's boots. The driver's boots have been around the external community. They're walking on feed bags, and here we have a farm worker that is going between the farm, between the feed truck and into the farm directly to deliver feed. When this was identified, a timeout was given to understand, look, we have downtime for people to be 5 days before we can enter. They must shower, but you're bringing feed in bags that are being walked on by people from the outside. That's a huge risk. When this was identified, it was a revelation, of course, and the conversion to using feed bins happened immediately. But this is really part of understanding what is your biosecurity and putting a monitoring process in place so that you can identify when things are going wrong, but also document that things are going right. So now I'd like to show you an example. Dr. Tom Gillespie presented this information at the Perspective, and he was using data that he collected from a production system where you can see that the average mortality for 5 months was around 30 to 40%, quite high. And then he implemented a vaccination protocol of both the PCV2 and PRRS vaccinations because they were identified as part of the causes of this mortality. For the next 5 months, they monitored the mortality and identified much lower mortality as well as the variability around that mortality. So then the question was, can they remove one of those vaccines? Vaccination 3 protocol removed the PRRS vaccine and it was just the PCV2. And you can see that mortality increased slightly, but the variability actually increased. So again, after 5 months, they returned to both circovirus and PRRS virus vaccinations. And you can see again, the mortality went down, but even more important, the variability within the groups of this production system reduced. And so you can definitely see the value of not only what their interventions were, but the fact that they can visualize these interventions, the impact of these interventions on mortality in a chart process. For communication, this is highly valuable. And so last, when we talk about measuring, we've talked about production indicator measurings, routine diagnostics. And historically, we have used serology and blood collection from pigs. With our large populations now, it's really difficult to get a correct sample size to give us good sensitivity on low prevalence. And so we actually have, in many of our countries, really now depended a lot on oral fluid collection. And more recently, even, we have here tails and testicles from processing, and processing fluid is becoming a highly valuable sample matrix for early detection or detection in monitoring early diseases. So let's use PRRS and talk about how do we measure and monitor herds for PRRS status. So in the US and other countries, although we still focus abundant energy and effort on PRRS virus, we are more effective in our control programs because we actually are managing PRRS outbreaks with more intention. We have a load, close, and homogenized program that has been well established, well documented, and the homogenized has been really a decision between using a modified live vaccine or live virus inoculation. The things that we haven't had until recently is the measure of success for PRRS control because we didn't have a good definition for stability. So with this need for a universal language, the AASV and the USDA created a task force. And from that task force, this categorization or PRRS status has come out. And the publication was in the Journal of Swine Health and Production in 2011. And ultimately, the point was, what is our definition of PRRS stable? And it was determined that the definition of PRRS stable was the fact that you must be weaning PRRS negative pigs, and PRRS negative pigs was determined by a certain number of weaned pig per PCR negative test over a 90-day period. Your sow farms can still be PRRS positive, but the sows are not shedding virus to the piglets. That's ultimately the definition. And you can see here that we ended up with the categories of 1, 2, 3, and 4 for an unstable farm, a stable farm, provisionally negative farm, and a negative farm. And the definitions were that an unstable farm had positive signs of PRRS on the farm and PRRS detection. A stable farm had 90 days, so 4 separate consecutive testing, PCR negatives, and that's on a monthly basis, and no indication of PRRS at the Southford level. Provisionally negative was a term that was used for those herds that were rolling into a true elimination status. And so they actually would introduce negative replacement gilts and then monitor those negative animals specifically. So you can see here that their exposure status might be positive for the sow farm, but that the shedding status and the detection status would be testing those negative replacement animals coming in. And then, of course, you only achieved this 4 status when your herd was actually totally rolled over and your exposure animal of all animals was negative. So now that we have a definition for stability, Dr. Linares added to our knowledge and terminology by creating terms TTS, so time to stability, which is the time to PRRS negative pig production, also known as TTNP, as well as TTBP, time to baseline production, the production that's based on the average of the 21 weeks prior to the PRRS outbreak. And as Linares measured differences between protocols, he actually looked at 60 different farms that had gone through PRRS outbreaks. He found that the mean time to negative production was 6 months. You see here, 26 weeks, but that the range was vast. However, when he looked at actually herds that were previously exposed versus herds that were never exposed, the time to negative pigs was significantly less in herds that actually had previous exposure to PRRS, 26 weeks versus 29 weeks that it took to negative pig production. Next, when Linares looked at time to baseline, time it took to get back to baseline production, he compared the live virus inoculation protocol to the modified live vaccination, and he found that the modified live mass vaccination was actually achieving baseline production in 10 weeks post exposure, post vaccination, versus 21 weeks for the live virus inoculation. And that the modified live vaccination protocol had fewer losses, and the previously exposed sows responded even quicker. So what he found ultimately was that the modified live vaccination, the mass vaccination, saved 1,443 more pigs. More recently, there has been an update to this PRRS status classification, and in fact, this was in just the most recent September-October Journal of Swine Health and Production. Because if you think about it, the protocol that was written was for sample size based on the detection of 10% prevalence with a 95% confidence. But what if the prevalence was lower than 10%? And we do know that we're seeing that there appeared to be PRRS in nursery pigs, that even though the weaned pigs seemed to test negative, within 3 to 4 weeks, the nurseries were breaking with PRRS of the identical virus at the sow farm. And so the true question was, have we detected it at a sensitive enough level? And that's why they went back to regrouping. The problem is that we were using serum as our sample type, and we knew that we would become more sensitive if we tested more frequently or more animals, but that would take an additional amount of labor. The solution that has been revealed is population sampling. And as I alluded to previously, processing fluids and oral fluid collection has been an incredible bonus and advantage for monitoring, and particularly in the detection of low prevalence pathogens in these populations. So here we have, again, this is in the Journal of Swine Health and Production. Dr. Lopez has defined processing fluids. He's gone through the steps of creating the processing fluid from the collection of a room of tails and testicles cut at processing, and using cheesecloth to remove the liquid. In his study, he was using a single processing fluid, which was representing a room of pigs that equaled about 256 pigs, comparing that to 30 random samples of pigs collected from the litters. And what he found was that actually the processing fluids by the room, as a detection of PRRS at the room level, were more sensitive than the serum sampling. And as he charted this by room, you actually can see that there's similar, very similar or homologous results between the green processing fluid, here we have CTs, compared to the blood serum, and even we have positives where the serum identified negative samples. So it does end up being at a population a much more sensitive sample type. And therefore, the proposed modification was using these sample types to help get at the lower prevalence, the potential for lower prevalence. And what they ended up with was differentiating between a status 1A and a status 1B. A status 1A was determined positive unstable with a high prevalence of PRRS, and a status 1B was a positive unstable with low prevalence of PRRS. Therefore, it was intermittent sampling, as intermittent PRRS detection in these weaned pigs. And again, here, as I was mentioning, the improvements were that they included various options beyond serum for supporting evidence in defining the characteristics of each of the statuses. So option 1 would be the original, that you would use serum, but option 2 and option 3 included PRRS PCR from processing fluids, which can be done weekly. And again, that gives you a high sensitivity, not just because it's a population sample, but because you can do it frequently. You always have those samples available, and therefore it's simply submitting it to the laboratory. And then, of course, family oral fluids or oral fluids in weaning pigs, again, is more of a group sample, which as an aggregated sample is very sensitive at the population level. So follow-up research with this sample type of talking about pooling, and whether it's pooling of oral fluids or pooling of the processing fluids. In general, pooling is not a great idea because you know that you'll be losing sensitivity. So when you want a highly sensitive test, then we should avoid pooling. But if you have a high prevalence of PRRS, or if you know that the sow farm is circulating PRRS, for example, then what you see in this study is that Asemeke is identifying that pooling really has no effect when you have a high prevalence or CTs less than 34 of PRRS detection, but pooling is very impactful when you talk about very low prevalence. And again, your low prevalence in this study was using a CT greater than 36. So if the majority of the animals may be negative, then it is not advised to do pooling. And when we look at how does using a different sample type impact our time to stability, going back to Dr. Linares' work, in all honesty, because we have a more sensitive test at the population level, we did actually have, which would be expected, more positives periodically, which increased the time it took to become stable at the sow farm. So using this novel sample type, because it is sensitive at the population level, does increase our time to stability, so our time to negative pig production. But again, it makes it much more clear, and it improves our classification. Processing fluids will have PCRs positives longer, again, because you're looking at the whole population almost, as opposed to just a select few animals. Another follow-up research was performed by Trevisani et al., where he was looking at weekly cohorts of processing fluids and wanting to understand whether processing fluid CTs or CQ values could be predictors of nursery mortality. The expectation is that CTs that were low, with evidence of significant amount of PRRS nucleic acid, does it reflect into higher mortality in the nursery? So he created 4 categories of CTs or CQs in his processing fluids: low, less than 27, medium, 27 to 34, high, 34 to 37, and then of course negative. And what you see on the left are the CQs or CTs of the processing fluid, and on the right is the mortality associated with each of those groups. And in fact, he did identify that the CQ values can be used as an indicator for the expected cumulative nursery mortality differences. So the topic of evolving into population sample is really arising from the fact that our populations are larger now. And so taking individual animals and having them represent these large populations is really not the best way to sample and to understand disease and disease transmissions. From those early studies of crickets, from Dr. Zimmerman's students, we have gone from starting and working on oral fluid diagnostics to actually having oral fluid diagnostics be 375,000 samples that come to our diagnostic labs, our key swine diagnostic labs in the US. So that included South Dakota, Iowa State, and Minnesota. The vast majority of those are oral fluid PCRs, so between 300 and 325,000 samples a year. And that was up to the year 2016. Oral fluids is definitely the predominant sample type, and now with processing fluids, we are really being innovative and submitting a lot more diagnostics with these novel sample types because we appreciate the fact that we're already collecting, or it's easy to collect these samples, and they are a valuable diagnostic sample. We've gone from single small farms to large multi-site production, and individual animal samplings just can't represent that well. We needed a new and simple diagnostic method that was also accurate and informative. And the individual samples were not compatible for efficient surveillance in our large systems. What we really need to do now is to harmonize our oral fluid procedures at the laboratory for optimum performance and reducing the variability across laboratories. From this last study by Kraft, you can see that if you looked at antibody ELISAs done by using oral fluids as the sample type, we're at 41,000. Oral fluid specimens for nucleic acid sequencing, were over 2,000. And again, in 2016, we were at 300 and almost 25,000 PCRs with oral fluids, and we're significantly above that now. And again, the value of monitoring with oral fluids was described in Olson back in 2013, where he took a known prevalence and placed known status pigs in a known prevalence of 4, 8, 12, 20% infection rate, and knowing their blood status, then took the pen oral fluids, and you can see that there is a vast improvement in the ability to detect at the pen level when you knew you had a 20% prevalence in a pen. So 5 pigs in a pen of 25 were viremic. You had an 80% probability of detecting that pen as positive with oral fluids. So that's an incredible advantage when you're talking about the number of samples that you will need and the ability to detect at low prevalences. So what can we learn through oral fluid monitoring in growing pigs? And how do we use oral fluid monitoring for production parameter monitoring? This study by Mora et al. Used oral fluids to understand the impact of PRRS burden in a field study through associating the PRRS status with mortality. And in it, he was conveniently sampling 7 PRRS stable flows and 2 unstable flows. So PRRS stable, again, means that they were weaning negative pigs versus unstable flows, meaning they were PRRS positive at placement. And then those piglets were placed in areas of high pig density and therefore high exposure to PRRS. And what he found was that there were differences, of course, between the PRRS stable scenario and the unstable scenarios in mortality. But that the protocol that he used also, the vaccination protocol, also had an impact and reduced mortality further when he looked at the stable scenarios and the unstable scenarios. And so what he found was that in pig dense areas where he used the protocol 2, there was significantly less mortality than protocol 1, and that increased at even higher levels of PRRS challenge, with similar impacts in both stable and unstable flows. And Dr. Sticka presented this in Lehman in 2017, where we were monitoring using oral fluids to identify the pathogen burden during an entire grow out with biweekly or every 2-week oral fluid sampling, and then understanding the differences in mortalities between the different patterns of pathogens. And here you see green represents detection of PRRS virus, blue represents detection of influenza, and red represents detection of mycoplasma. There were 25 different sites that were involved in this study, and there's 12 here. You can see the variability and the differences of the pathogens that were detected, the times they were detected, the frequencies that they were detected between PRRS, influenza, and mycoplasma. But what the study found was there's lots of variability, lots of respiratory pathogens in as far as burdens on these pigs, and there was also a lot of influenza for a very long time. But when you look at the patterns of burden, pathogen burden, it was associated with significant differences in mortality. And for example, if both PRRS and influenza were detected in one of these flows, the mortality was on the average 13.7%. So let's circle back. Where does serologic monitoring add value in today's pig production now that we've talked about the advent of new sample types and population sampling? Serology can add value when we monitor gilts, and whether that is antibody monitoring with serum or antibody monitoring with oral fluids, because those tests do exist, we know that gilts are a high risk for disease introduction and immune variability to the sow farm. So what you see here is a typical diagnostic report where you may, on the right, see the results are the PRRS ELISA STP ratios, and in the center you see the ages of the animals that were bled. I think those are P1s, P2s, P3s, and greater. And in all honesty, this is kind of difficult to understand in a tabular format, so what I would end up doing was putting these in a figure, and in this case a histogram, where I can see the differences in both the average and the range of the animals that I bled, from gilts to P1s, P2s and 3s, and then 3s and greater. So the following is an example of monitoring with serology in a gilt developer. In this gilt developer, where animals were roughly 10 weeks of age entering the GDU, they were to be vaccinated for PRRS with modified live vaccine. At that time, the caregivers were vaccinating at convenience, and therefore the ELISAs were much more variable. I instituted this monitoring of serology 6 weeks, 12 weeks, and then at entry into the sow farm to help our caregivers understand the purpose of vaccination timing and the need for all of the gilts to be immunized at the same time. What you see here is a little more variability at the start of our project, and then as we pursued from 6 weeks into 12 weeks, you can see that our average S2P ratios not only declined, but they became much less variable because the program was actually instituted in a much more systematic fashion at gilt entry. And then finally, the gilts were also serologically tested after they entered the sow farm prior to breeding, so that we could finally see that not only were they immunized, but that they actually had their S2P ratios had become virtually negative because the entire population was immunized at the same time. So this charting with using blood serology in gilts has shown us that it adds consistency and, again, a way to communicate the why of, again, an important part of managing gilts is the proper timing of vaccination. So what are the take-home messages from today's discussion? First, I hope that I've shared the importance and the value that creating visual monitoring tools are. For example, the statistical process control charting, and you can use them in production, health, biosecurity, as well as your diagnostic monitoring. We also want to make sure that we're documenting our interventions in these monitoring charts. We want to look for reduced variability and improvements in KPIs, or we also want to find the outliers, any aberrant testing results, or unexpected results. But the final part is we must do something. We must have an action or activity associated with that indicator. Next, use diagnostics strategically and communicate them with these visual tools. Monitoring piglets with processing fluids, family oral fluids can be used very effectively to define, in this case that we've talked about, the PRRS status, but you can also use them for other pathogens. Create those graphs and use them for communication. It's very effective. Oral fluids are versatile. They're sensitive to population sampling, population status, health status for most swine pathogens. Serologic monitoring can be useful if monitoring for PRRS vaccination compliance is desired, but we have to be really careful not to use monitoring with serology as a snapshot in time. We should be following the same groups over time to understand their change. Otherwise, the results are very hard to interpret. And last, low prevalence pathogens are better detected using this population-based sample type. For example, the oral fluids and processing fluids. We may be able to start using these for our important foreign animal disease surveillance. We know that we can use fewer samples, but we can sample more frequently, and it is an observation of the population as whole. We should expect to find more positives with increased testing of endemic pathogens, but this will improve our success of identifying the root of the problem. We do need to also appreciate that sample handling for these alternative sample types is imperative, and that actually they're very sensitive to the cold chain. Thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to our questions.
Every time you take a group of hogs to market, you end up asking yourself the same questions. Was their weight potential achieved? Could they have performed better? What if that last truckload went to market sooner? If those are the questions keeping you up at night, you're not using 3-Flex. 3-Flex from the beginning offers a pig its best shot at achieving maximum weight at the end. It reduces variability so well, studies show it can get the last 20% of your barn to market faster. It's the industry's first and only USDA-licensed trivalent PRDC protocol to provide immunity against 3 of the toughest respiratory diseases in a single syringe, which makes it the most complete PRDC protection on the market. It's simple, really. Use better disease protection. Take more pounds to market. Turn the barn faster. Sleep a little better at night. That's 3-Flex. Because with any other PRDC protocol, you're leaving weight behind. Pig after pig after pig.
Okay, thank you very much from Dr. Godel's lecture. I would like to encourage the audience to type their questions in the Q&A box after each lecture so that you will not forget your questions, and so that our panel can collate them afterwards during the Q&A portion. So the second lecture is sponsored by Alltech Philippines.
Our speaker graduated from the University of the Philippines, Los Baños, with Bachelor of Science in Agriculture, major in Animal Science, with 3 years experience as pig and livestock specialist in Cebu City, 4 years with a swine integrator in the Philippines, with various roles from breeding up to slaughter operations, 7 years as a regional manager for Cargill Animal Nutrition, and 11 years in Alltech Asia Pacific as a species team leader for swine and product manager for organic trace minerals. Currently, an independent pig production and nutrition consultant for Asia Pacific, covering key pig integrators in the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. He will talk about the guilds we prepare now will shape our industry in the next 2 years. It is an honor to have Mr. Arturo Jose Frio.
Good day, everyone, to all who are attending the PCSP forum. Thank you very much for being here today. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present the best practices that we have been doing in the past number of years in terms of preparing the gills. So sabi nga nila, the gills that we are going to select and prepare in the coming months will actually dictate how our industry will fare in the next 2 to 3 years. So this is really very critical now that everybody's looking for repopulation. So what I'm going to prescribe or present today would be the accumulation of years of experience in different countries in terms of how guilds are properly selected for better or best performance, to optimize its performance. So, paano ba tayo mag-grow, di ba? Paano tayo mag-grow in terms of our repopulation? Sabi nga nila, before we really start doing the activities for repopulation, we must think ahead. And hindi pwedeng we rebuild back what we had before, but perhaps this is a golden opportunity for everybody to build towards the future. And one of the things that we are really advocating is to look at the sow productivity of each herd. Itong mga genetics na meron tayo, they could really produce more than 20 egg cells or ova or follicles. And kung matuloy ito mabuntis and mawalay ang baboy na to, and then you cycle the sow 2.4 to 2.5 times a year, then the gold standard is really 30 pigs per sow per year. For those farms who are just starting or repopulating or have been in this industry for quite some time, think about using these genetics to the fullest. Kasi sayang we are already at the heights of itong magagandang genetics. Our gold standard is really to get to 30 pigs per sow per year for us to become globally competitive. So key to sow productivity is knowing the numbers. So we have two very basic parameters, liters per sow per year, or yung number of times the sow could give birth and produce pigs, and also the number of pigs that they could produce out of that parity or that farrowing. So the potential is really huge. The potential of these animals could really become 30, 35 at the most, or at the least maybe. As long as alam natin yung numbers and alam natin kung paano ayusin itong numbers na to, these are all gonna make sense in terms of our bottom line. And all is dependent upon the machine, the engine. It's called gilt preparation. So sabi nga nila, if you have a really well oiled or very good machine in your production, then it all starts there. Once you prepare the gilts properly, then you will have lesser headaches along the way. How much is a gilt? How much is the cost of a gilt here in the Philippines? So if we only calculate from 6 months old until the time it farrows, so the feed is somewhere around almost half a ton, around 10,000 siguro. And then vaccines will be about 400 or about close to $10. Others will be 10 or 20%. So ang cost of production or cost of preparing the gilt from 6 months until manganak siya is about 13,000, give or take, maybe 15,000. Sabi nga nila, garbage in is garbage out. Or if you fail to prepare, you better prepare to fail. And that's about it. If you have a very bad gilt at the start, don't expect your sow to perform. So that's what we are here for. So how do we measure the success of any gilt? So we've gone through a series of different information, and I think the The next would be really to understand, paano ba natin i-rate yung gills? Paano ba natin siya ginigrade? Ano? The first hurdle is to make sure that 100% of yung pinrepair mong gills should successfully farrow at parity 1. So that's the first hurdle. The second hurdle is that when you do your audit, mid-year or mid-lifetime audit, as they say, pagdating ng parity 3, your pigs should have weaned more than 30 pigs. Alright? Because imposible nang magkaroon ng 65 pigs wean per lifetime or more if you haven't done any 30 pigs sa first 3 parities. And then of course the third hurdle will be lifetime pigs wean should be around 65 or more, and then that whole parity 1 to 6 should be finished in 2.5 years or better. So this is itong pinaka-goal ng ating gill preparation. I'd like to present to you some of the practical gill selection tips which are science-based. Kasi marami sa gill preparation ngayon, sa gill selection actually is decided upon by 1 or 2 people, basically breeder man. Ang first selection yan actually should be the birth weight. There's a study that was done by Patterson over 7,000 GGP large white and landrace gills that they prepared over a number of years. And they saw that birth weight actually affects the overall performance. So if they select, sabi nila, if they select gills na maliit, less than 1.2 kilos ang birth weight, there's a very high chance na hindi nila marireach yung puberty at yung first estrus on time. If you select 1.35 and above, then they have higher stillbirths sa P1 and P2, parity 1, parity 2. Then sa parity 2, they also found that most of these gills have lower litter size pagdating sa parity 2. And then finally, they also said that itong mga gills ito malalaki actually had a low retention o hindi na nakakaabot ng parity 4. So they concluded that maybe the ideal is about 1.2 to 1.35. So this is the ideal that would produce the most out of a single lifetime. So the suggested second selection is, of course, looking at first the physical traits. The hind legs, the pastern, the shape of the chest, the vulva, the body length, etc. So those are really very basic. But then some of the genetic companies have found out also that perhaps the lifetime ADG or the ADG from birth, the best ones that they have calculated is coming from gills from 560, 600 grams per day. So this is about 85 to 90 kilos at 5 months old. So from our experience, if we have a gilt which is selected very low, 80, 81, 84 or 87 or sorry 78 kilos or lesser, they have a smaller frame, and then ang experience namin dito is yung litter size nila will always be compromised. Siyempre, if you have a small body cavity, then you also have a lower litter size. Doon sa mga malalaki, they have a very big tendency to become big and fat. So, mga parity 1, parity 2 pa lang, they always have this problem of higher stillbirth and also nawawala ng gatas. So I guess there's a correlation between body size and the weight at 5 months old. So that has to be considered. Then we also need to take a look at our gills in terms of the number of teats that we have. So dati traditionally 12 to 14 is accepted. Now I think we should look for 16 to 18 teats na. 16 to 18 teats. So I'll just put here 14 kasi marami tayong mga farmers who are using fattener female, so wala sila ibang choice kundi gamitin yung animals na yun. But then we have to strive and make sure that we have enough teats to cover all if you have a really very big litter size coming. So the final selection occurs at 6 months old. So dapat nasa within 100 to 110 kilos na siya, not less or not more. And the lifetime ADG would perhaps be around 500 to 600. So ito yung mga mukhang magandang growth rates. We have to have a P2 backward of about 13 millimeters or more. So we are using the Nowhere caliper score, and we're pegging it at around 12 to 14. And then another thing that we need to consider is that kasi katatapos lang ito ng first vaccination, whether it's PRRS or SIV or other viral um, vaccine. Our policy is we observe the animal, and if it's not recovering within 36 hours, so medyo lilemya-lemya pa siya, we don't use that as a breeder. Hindi na namin siya pinapasa. Kasi chances are, from our experience, that they are also going to carry some diseases along the way. And then, ang last vaccination day namin is about 210 days. So, no more than 210 because we need to mate these animals at somewhere around 245 days, 240 days. Kung dumami po, tumagal pa yung ating bakuna dyan, then it delays everything, and then mamaya matanda na yung gilt natin, and then that will not be productive. So, sa final selection, it's really key that a key personnel should handle this one. So, iniiwan natin kasi lahat sa breeder man to do the selection in final picking ng animals si breeder man, we have to educate them that all of these things na tinuturo natin should be done kasi everything, our gilt selection process has to be based on science. Hindi pwedeng mata-mata na lang na pinili ko siya kasi mukhang magandang katawan, pero you don't really know the estrus dates, we don't know the weights, we don't know the vaccine response of this animal, and we won't probably know if they're going to reach farrowing at P1 and even at P4. So, kaya very, very important na we get the breeder man on board on this selection criteria so that we will maximize the performance of these gilts. Listed here is the recommended breeding guide for 4 types of genetic companies. So some of them will probably say 210 days or 230 days minimum target weights of 130 to 160. Then they also have a target for P2 backfat minimums. And then when to mate, is it the second heat, third heat, or second or third heat? It depends. But based on our practice, we have found that across the board, the best practice is to mate them somewhere around 225 to 45 days with a weight of around 130 to 150, a caliper score of more than 12. So 12 to 14 is ideal, and we do the first insemination at the second heat. So this is across the board. We have been fortunate enough to work with different genetic companies all across Asia Pacific, and from our consulting, we found out that the best practice for us here in Asia would be somewhere around those numbers, and we get the most out of these animals. So in the 1990s, it was documented that a gilt which is mated at around 130 to 150 kilos will give us more pigs over 5 parities. So yung productivity ng female actually is within that range. But this is way back in 1990s. So fast forward 2005, na-document na rin na within 135 to 170 is going to give more pigs rather than if you mate below 135 or you mate above 170. So meron talagang dimensions, or meron talagang specs na kailangan in terms of weight para maging productive yung ating animals. And even the Danish breeds actually say that mating at second estrus, regardless of the age of the first estrus, they got much more significantly higher piglets if you are doing the second estrus. So this was in one of the key breeding companies in Europe. And then again in 2012, another documentation showing that the third estrus yields the best number of piglets in this genotype, so in this genetics. So there are differences among genotypes, there are differences among genetics. So upon reviewing all of this available information, whether it's the age or the weight, we ask the question, meron bang effect ang history ng gilts sa productivity in terms of the lifetime? So we are here at the First 10 Consulting, we're piloting a Philippine study looking at the different factors, controllable factors that could predict total born from parity 1 to parity 3. So this is local version. We want to do a regression correlation analysis on different things, and we want to establish kung ano ba talaga, mating weight ba ang may bearing? Or is it the time of estrus? Or is it the pubertal age itong animals to? Are there also breed differences? So this is the set of questions that we would like to understand. And coming from the initial or preliminary results from our study, this is local gilts which are grown in open air shed. We found out that the best total born from parity 1 to parity 3, these are GP and GGP animals, is from a weight range of 1.2 to around 1.5. So if you go beyond 1.5, they have lesser. If you go below 1.2, it also goes lesser. So medyo in tune siya dun sa Patterson study that showed that merong effect on birth weight in terms of total born. So we also looked at the average weight at mating, the mating age, and then the first day of estrus, all of those things, pero hindi pa conclusive because maybe we have a smaller population size. So I'd like to invite farmers out there, if you want to participate in this study, please do so. It will really be meaningful for us. But one of the things that we have found was the caliper score at mating actually affects total born from parity 1 to parity 3. So what we found here is that yung caliper score number 13 is actually giving us the best number of total born. So if you go below, medyo payat, or go beyond, medyo mataba, then we see that it's not going to be the best in terms of productivity. Now that we have a set of different guidelines to select the proper conformation and proper age or proper weight of the gilts, one of the very critical things that we need to look at is how we are feeding these animals. The traditional way is to use an ordinary grower diet, right? It's just a growing animal, sabi nga nila. Weights are always estimated, the back fat is actually disregarded. Ito yung yung ginagawa nila to grow them as quick as possible, tapos pag masyado nung malaki, then they restrict feeding, diba? Yun yung yun yung mali eh. And then these are all based on mata-mata system. Everybody just relies on eyeball and luck, diba? If you have a pool of gilts, 100 of them, mata-mata na lang, yan pasado, yan hindi. Remember that 80% ng gastos natin is feeds. So 80% of the cost of a gilt produce is feeds. So we have to make sure that we are using that resource to feed and develop the reproductive tract. So it's preparing and protecting the ovary, so by the time it becomes sexually mature, it will produce as many follicles as possible. There's also feeding for immunity program, because remember, these gilts are bombarded with a number of different vaccines on a weekly basis. So they need fuel, they need all of the things required to respond to all of these vaccines. So we have to also consider feeding for immunity, and perhaps feeding the reproductive tract and feeding for immunity would bring about a much better longevity for these gilts. So it's very common nowadays to have a gilt developer diet. Meron mga iba-ibang types of gilt developer programs or diets by different companies. We found a balance. We struck a balance in between, and we found out that ito yung maganda talaga for these animals. Remember, maybe 95% of the time our herd is composed of large white land races. So that's a fact. Meron lang siguro ang genetic differences in terms of peculiarities, like mga sinelect for this type of traits, but then they will always be based on large white land races. Alright? So what we found out was the net energy of 232,350, ME siguro 3150 hanggang 32. Lysine would range from 0.65 to 0.8. Then we have your amino acid balance there versus lysine. I highlighted here some of the critical ones. NDF, or neutral detergent fiber, it has to be 15% minimum with the use of multiple fiber sources, and I'll explain a little bit. We also have to have an organic form of selenium. That really matters. There has to be no metabolic modifiers, chromium, ractopamine, all of those which could disrupt the fat formation of this animal. This has all to be taken away from the gilt developer diet. Remember also that vitamin B6 has to be a minimum of 12 milligrams per kilo. Why? Because the success of selenium absorption depends on the amount of vitamin B6. Vitamin B6 plays a role in the conversion of one of those selenium molecules into a more absorbable form, and this actually makes the difference. Kahit nalagyan mo yan na 1 ppm na selenium, organic, or maganda yung selenium mo, but if you don't have enough vitamin B6, then it's not going to be absorbed properly. Alright? So, ang idea dito is from 85 to 100 kilos, better restrict mo lang muna to 2.5 to 3 kilos para hindi masyadong lumaki yung guilt. And then, as soon as dumating siya sa 6 months, 100 kilos na siya, 110 kilos, dyan mo siya i-ad libitum. I-ad libitum mo na siya dyan using the same diet. So, that's how we usually do the guilt developer program. So, bakit ba importante yung NDF fiber? So, ang alam lang natin dito, gestation lang yan, di ba? Yung fiber, the right form of fiber will produce a right water binding capacity, thereby you have a better hindgut fermentation, you have volatile fatty acids. This is the opportunity for you to set the GI tract of the guilt. Why is it important? Because di ba pagka hindi pa natin na-mate yung ating guilt, sometimes meron ka ng mga vulval discharge, meron ka ng vaginal infection na nangyayari. Everything, yung mga infection na yan actually comes from the feces. Di ba? Pag lumagpak yung feces, the first organ that is contaminated will be the vulva. So you'll have contamination agad. And yung from the vagina until sa uterus, napakadumi ng environment na yan. It's a whole playing ground for different types of bacteria. So using the right NDF now could actually set up your sow to a much better performance because mas maganda yung kanyang bacterial profile. So feeding the right fiber habang guilt pa siya actually would influence your performance. So this is a very good study that was done in Japan. Tinignan nila yung high performers, 28 pigs weaned, and then low performers, 19 pigs weaned. They actually differ in the amount of acetate propionate butyrate production. They have lesser pathogens because they are being fed much better fiber. So it makes a lot of sense if you start feeding the good fiber to the gills so that pagdating nila as sows, they will have a much shorter time to adjust. So mas makukuha natin yung ating performance. So, one of the things that kailangan natin ingatan is zearalenone. So, I won't really deal much about this one, but remember that if your feed contains a little bit of zearalenone, then it's not going to work for the fertility of these animals. This is a very early study that was done, and nakita natin dito that if you are feeding gills with as high as 64 ppm of zearalenone, then wala ka na makikitang follicles, because it's already damaging the ovary. So what happens to the ovary? If you look at the center of the photo, that's the normal one is in the center. That's your normal ovary. And then you could see the little bumps there would actually be some of the follicles. If you have a cystic ovary, which could be caused by a lot of different things, but mycotoxicosis or mycotoxins could be one of them or be the major culprit. And you could see that some of these ovaries will not function anymore. So this would lead to anestrus, it would lead to irregular cycles, and most often than not, it would lead to permanent infertility. So we call the animal very early, maybe parity 2, parity 3, frequent return to heat, or they have lower litter size. That would be a sign that the ovary is not responding anymore. One of the things I emphasized a while ago is the use of organic selenium to improve fertility. And in this example, we have no selenium, and then we have your one form of selenium, and then another would be organic selenium. And what we have found here is that we have a much better selenium in the blood at parity 2 and parity 3 if we are using the organic form of selenium. The main question here is, why is this very important? Why is it important to elevate selenium levels in the blood in the gills? The importance of selenium is that it improves ovulation rate in gills. So we have here from the exercise, organic selenium actually produces more follicles by way of corpora lutea. So you have an average of 21, where your other forms of selenium, including the inorganic one, actually just produce 17 follicles. Also, we found a much higher LH peaks. So your LH peaks would influence the standing heat, the behavior patterns of the animal, and the quality of the follicles that are shed by the sow. So organic selenium is very, very important in the gilts. It sets up the gilts for better fertility. So all of the things that we have discussed, the physical attributes, the estrus targets, and all the feeding programs that are being implemented in our consulting, this is a snapshot of a gilt development program from us, and we continuously research for new things and try it out in the farm and then adjust as proper. But this really shows us in a snapshot where the greatest opportunity is to have a control on the quality of gilts that we are producing. So to summarize my talk for today, remember that the gilts we are preparing now will form the foundation of our industry in the next coming years. So whatever we decide today, whatever we do and execute, those will give us the results, hopefully, that we are looking for in the next coming years. Remember, if you fail to prepare the gilt, prepare to fail. It's really very difficult to correct a sow problem if you can trace back that problem to how you prepare the gilt. All right, so spend some time and effort on preparing those animals. Let's focus on having a correct mating target and looking at other parameters such as birth weight and back fat, its impact on the performance of these animals. Let's also take a look at how we feed these gilts. We have to strive for better feeding for fertility. Remember, organic selenium, NDF fiber, vitamin B6, and control of zearalenone will have an impact on the performance of these animals, especially during the time that they are being vaccinated until the time they give birth for the first time at parity 1. So if you are successful with the first 3 hurdles, then chances are the industry that you're going to see in the coming 2 to 3 years will be really very good. So let's strive to get 30 pigs per sow per year, and for those who are doing that already, let's strive to get to 35 pigs per sow per year. So thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed my talk. I'll be open for questions if you have. Thank you very, very much. Salamat po sa inyong lahat. And salamat po sa aking host. Thank you.
The microbiome is the community of microorganisms that inhabit an animal. Beneficial microbes help to form a protective barrier, lining the gut and preventing the growth of pathogenic bacteria such as Salmonella, Campylobacter, Clostridia, and E. coli, among others. In doing this, the microbiome helps to address 2 critical challenges in the agricultural industry: food safety and antibiotic use. The association between greater microbial diversity and increased resistance to pathogen colonization is well documented. Recent research demonstrates that enhancing microbial diversity can potentially reduce the Campylobacter load in the cecum. It can also minimize the attachment and invasion of bacteria, such as Salmonella and E. coli, into cells, which can cause infection. These infections can cause inflammation, which will lead to villi damage and poor nutrient absorption. Antibiotics, whether given in feed for growth promotion or even at therapeutic levels to treat specific diseases, adversely affect the gut microbiome by reducing microbial diversity. This can lead to a cycle whereby overall microbial diversity is decreased, allowing for the growth and expansion of resistant species to the detriment of non-resistant commensal strains. Alltech's gut health solutions are designed to repair and rehabilitate the gut microflora by enhancing the overall microbial diversity. Changing nutritional supplements in the diet can lead to reductions in pathogen load, enhance the gut's resistance to pathogen colonization, and curtail the abundance of antibiotic-resistant strains. Normalizing the gut microflora helps to boost microbial diversity. A diverse microbiome then shifts the balance, reducing the pathogen load in the gut. This in turn breaks the cycle caused by antibiotic use, decreasing antimicrobial resistance. Finally, enhanced microbial diversity leads to a healthier gut, which results in improved nutrient digestibility. Microbial diversity is the key to gut health. Alltech knows the importance of establishing a favorable microbial population and maintaining it throughout life.
Thank you, Mr. Frio, for the practical tips on. So now we are ready to listen to our third lecturer, lectured by DSM Nutritional Products. Again, please type your questions directed to Mr. Frio in the Q&A box.
Great morning, everyone. To discuss our next topic, our Piglet Survival Toolbox, now and into the future. Allow me to introduce to you Dr. Gerbelia J. Abililia Messina, Regional Technical Manager for Swine, DSM Nutritional Products. Dr. Abililia completed her Bachelor of Science and Master's degree, both specializing in swine nutrition, at the University of the Philippines, Los Baños, and placed 8th on the agricultural licensure examination. She later earned her Doctor of Philosophy in Animal Science, Swine Nutrition from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, USA in 2018 under the guidance of Dr. Hans Stein. Dr. Abililia brings with her an extensive local industry experience, having worked as a nutritionist and researcher for a multinational feed manufacturer, as well as technical manager for a prominent feed additive company. In her current role, she is providing her technical expertise and support, as well as her love for pigs, to the Asia-Pacific region. She has served as a resource person for several international conferences and industry activities. Apart from this, Dr. Abililia authored and co-authored numerous global publications, abstracts, proceedings, and magazine features, all focused on pig nutrition and productivity. Once again, a warm welcome to Dr. Gerbelia Abililia Messina.
Thank you, Pam, for your kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Jarabella Abililia Messina, and I will discuss today about some nutritional intervention to address 3 different important factors as part of a holistic approach in preventing diseases in swine. ASF, or African swine fever, remains the single biggest threat to the swine industry, and ASF has been endemic for decades, initially observed in sub-Saharan Africa and in some regions in Europe. In 2018, China, which produces half of the global population of pigs, reported its first ASF outbreak, which quickly spread in other countries in Asia Pacific, EMEA, and recently in Latin America. So without a viable vaccine or treatment, ASF is unlikely to be eradicated and will continue to be a major threat to the swine industry. The animal industry has been facing a lot of challenges all at once. So we have disease challenges in front of mind, and also the traditional and reliable and cost-effective tools to deal with health challenges such as anti-growth promotants or therapeutic zinc oxides are becoming less and less available. And on top of that, the industry is also facing a lot of pressure from consumers to evaluate production measures to reduce environmental impact. So dealing with diseases has a great economic impact. To provide an estimate on economic impact of important swine diseases, our swine North American colleagues provided preliminary estimates of the economic losses based on 5,600 sow herd in the US for these diseases. So for PEDV, let's say a loss of 5 weeks of piglet production may cost a hog raiser of about 4.5 to 8 million pesos per thousand sows in a year. For PRRS, and with variable severity and duration, can cost a hog raiser around 9 to 36 million pesos per thousand sows in a year. And so these estimates can be very conservative, as we know that the cost of swine production in the Philippines is higher than in the US. For ASF, as what we have experienced in the Philippines, this is hugely detrimental with 100% culling of infected farms. And of course, it's also challenging as it takes a long time to repopulate the farms. And so therefore, a holistic approach is needed to prevent outbreak of diseases, particularly of African swine fever. So we know a lot of efforts has been made both by the government and private sectors from further spread of the disease. Although we do not share land borders with neighboring countries, ASF paved its way through pork movement, and the original cause of the outbreak in the Philippines has been suggested to be via infected pork product finding its way into swill feeding. And so since then, our efforts has been directed to prevent further spread of disease across islands, provinces, towns, and down to the infected neighboring pig farms. A lot of efforts has also been made to control movements of people and disinfection of transport vehicles going and in and out of the farm. However, even with this vigilance, we still continue to see outbreaks. And so therefore, there is still a need to fill other gaps by identifying and addressing different factors that could be the continuing entry points for the disease. And some of them may include the following, but not limited to feeds and feed ingredients, drinking water, health status of the pigs, foreign goods, air movement, or it can be pests or wild boar proximity. I would like to point out that there is no single factor to focus on to address this issue, but a bunch of things to address all at once to keep the disease out of our farm. But for this talk, I will only focus on three different factors, which is feed, water, and pig immunity. Now, let's take a look at feed as a vector of diseases. Historically, feed was not considered a vector for viral transmission until the PED outbreak in the US, which most likely originated in Asia. Research showed that pigs contaminated feed contracted PEDV in a laboratory setting, and so later on the term feed biosecurity was introduced. So question has been raised if the risk exists with other viruses such as ASF and with more feed ingredients. Dr. Scott D. from the Pipestone Veterinary Services in the US, who first provided the first proof of concept of PEDV transmission in feed, conducted a trial to evaluate different virus viability in feed ingredients and complete diets using a transboundary model. So the contaminated samples were transported transatlantic or transpacific for 30 and 37 days respectively. So the orange boxes here indicate that the viruses were detected in different samples. And we can see here that most of the viruses survived in ingredients such as soybean meal, even in lysine choline, and also in complete feeds. So let's have a quick look at the structure of some of the important viruses for swine. So you have the PED, porcine epidemic diarrhea, PRRS, porcine reproductive and respiratory syndrome, SVA, or Seneca virus A, which is also a surrogate for foot and mouth disease virus, and ASF, or African swine fever. Except for SVA, these viruses contain an envelope, and this is an important feature in addressing these viruses in swine. Disruption of the viral lipoprotein envelope results in loss of infectivity. So the envelope plays an important role in protecting the genetic material inside the virus and help in the attachment to host cells. So therefore, if the virus cannot attach, then they cannot colonize the cells. Also, envelope viruses are more sensitive to environmental conditions such as pH and temperature than non-envelope viruses. And so therefore, proactive interventions such as quarantining ingredients, thermal processing, or the use of feed additives as a final barrier should be considered. So the traditional use of benzoic acid as food and beverage preservative against fungi and bacteria, plus the well-documented antiviral effect of essential oils, suggest a possibility to mitigate viral transmission in feeds. So the essential oils disrupt the envelope and thereby inhibit viral replication. Benzoic acid, which in its unassociated form is effective against bacteria and other pathogens. And so therefore, the combination of these two components has been explored in recent studies and showed that the essential acid or essential oils accelerated virucidal effect of benzoic acid, presenting synergistic effects when combining these molecules. Dr. Scott D. conducted another study to evaluate the effects of different feed additives, which included the blend of the essential oils and benzoic acid in mitigating the risk of virus-contaminated feed using an ice block challenge model. So feeds were contaminated by using block of ice containing equal concentrations of PRRS, PED, and SVA virus. Ice block was manually dropped into the bin and feed and was delivered and consumed by natural feeding behavior. Moving on to the results, this table shows three treatment groups as part of the trial. You have the control group, and you have the two different levels of the blend of the organic acid and essential oils. So in control group, they were able to achieve 100% effectivity, which means that the ice block method works for contaminating the feeds. So with either inclusion rate of the blend, they were able to prevent the infection of the pigs or pens. And also, the blend was able to improve the growth performance of pigs versus that of the control group. And so this means that the blend was effective in preventing viral infection of diseases and can improve growth performance of pigs. In a trial on ASF, which was conducted at a university in China, ASF was inoculated in the feeds and sampling was done at day 1, 3, 6, and 9 after the inoculation. So treatment includes the positive control, meaning inoculated with ASF virus, negative control, no inoculation, benzoic acid, or the combination or blend of essential oils and benzoic acid. Hemabsorption, which is the adherence of red blood cells into a surface, was used as a test to evaluate the presence of live ASF virus. And this is a better test compared to that of PCR, where PCR does not differentiate live from dead virus. So the plus or minus signs indicates presence or absence of the virus. Positive control showing presence of virus and negative control, no virus, means that the model was qualified to test effectiveness of different feed additives. So for benzoic acid alone, you can observe here that it took 6 days to completely eliminate the virus. However, for the combination or blend of essential oils and benzoic acid, complete elimination of virus was observed even on the first day after inoculation. So what does it mean? This means that the blend effectively mitigated the risk of ASF virus in feed within 1 day, and therefore discounting the need for feed holding times. So how about in terms of animal performance? So this slide shows a summary of 5 different trials where we observed improvement in weight gain, feed intake, and FCR in weaned piglets. And this is an important consideration when selecting feed mitigants, as we know that the likes of formaldehyde-based products have safety and handling issues, which can also destroy protein in the feeds. And so you would expect no enhancement or even reduction in pig performance. So in summary, the blend of essential oils and benzoic acid mitigates feeds safely, protects viral infection, which has been shown even in the first day after inoculation of the pigs, and also improved growth performance in weaned pigs. So moving to the second factor, which is water as a vector of disease. A study conducted by Dr. Niederwerder and team from K-State showed that the level of virus required to cause infection in liquid was extremely low and demonstrating the high infectivity of ASF. So although they also mentioned that the likelihood of ASF infection is still lower via water versus that in feed, the risk cannot be ignored due to high consequences of this disease. So as an example, it has been implicated that contaminated water from the Nube River in Romania was responsible for introducing ASF in a big breeder farm. And we know that this can also be a potential threat, as we have seen in the news, dead pigs that are suspected to have ASF are being dumped in several waterways in the Philippines or even in other Asian countries. And so therefore, water treatment to improve water quality may be considered as part of the biosecurity. So chlorination is good. However, not a lot of evidence that it addresses viruses. And also to completely eliminate pathogens, this requires higher level of chlorine, which can have a negative impact on pig performance. So high level of chlorine reduces water intake. So if the pigs don't drink, they don't eat. And if they don't eat, they don't grow. Acidification improves effectiveness of chlorination. And we know that the reduction of pH, as demonstrated in previous studies, is able to reduce bacteria and viruses in water. So there are two different types of molecules that are being produced when chlorinating water depending on water pH. So we have the hypochlorous acid. This is a stronger disinfectant and antioxidant. And we have the hypochlorite ion. So if you lower the pH, you produce more of this hypochlorous acid. And so thereby, by acidifying water, you actually improve the disinfectant property of chlorine. An example of water acidifier has been previously shown to quickly react against naturally contaminated tap water with E. coli, as shown in this graph. And so therefore, a trial was conducted at African Swine Fever Regional Laboratory of China in Guangzhou this year to evaluate the ASF virus inhibition effect by this liquid blend by testing two different levels of this blend alone or in combination of sodium hypochlorite. So results show that the effectivity of liquid acid blend in combination of sodium hypochlorite completely killed ASF virus in 5 minutes. And so this means that the acidification and chlorination can be potentially explored as part of the ASF prevention at farm levels. So a simple holding tank for your treated water can eliminate the ASF risk from water sources. Moving to the third and last factor, it is important to ensure and support piglet immunity to combat these different types of diseases. So properly functioning immune system is vital to the health and survivability of these piglets. We will not go into the details of the immune system, but I would like to point out that robustness in production animal means finding the balance between sufficient disease resilience, and optimize production performance. So the ultimate goal here is to activate the immune system only when it's needed, so as not to affect the growth performance of these piglets. And there are several factors that influence the pig immune system, but for this talk, I will only focus on the nutritional part. Optimum immune system requires intricate balance of different nutrients, so one way to stimulate and enhance the health and immune system in piglets can be achieved with a multi-component nutritional approach. So this aims to activate the antibacterial activity, which can be elicited by beta-glucan, proliferation and regulation of immune cells with the use of 25-hydroxy-D3, and improvement of antioxidant properties of cells, such as vitamin E, C, and organic selenium, by combining these different molecules with non-competing metabolic pathway. So looking at the individual components of this multi-component approach, or the immunity booster, as we will call from now on. We have beta-glucans that trigger the first line of defense, which can increase the animal resilience to bacterial enteric challenges. Another component of this immunity booster is a 25-hydroxy-D3. So it has been shown in recent researches that vitamin D has a non-classical function on immune modulation and gut health, specifically in limiting excess immune response and decreasing pro-inflammatory cells. So in this study, newly weaned pigs were fed with different sources of vitamin D. So controlled diet contained standard vitamin D3 at 1500 IU per kilogram, higher levels of vitamin D3 at 3500 IU per kilogram for vitamin D3 group, or the 25-hydroxy-D3 group, which contains 50 micrograms of 25-hydroxy-D3 plus 1500 IU kilogram of vitamin D3. Results show that the pigs fed with 25-hydroxy-D3 significantly improved the number, viability, and phagocytic activity of immune cells. And so therefore, the form of vitamin matters in modulating the innate immune response of pigs. Another component is vitamin E. So vitamin E enhances the function and proliferation of lymphocytes, macrophages, and plasma cells involved in immune response, and protects the cells against oxidative damage. So when do pigs need the vitamin E the most? So feeding elevated levels of tocopherol or vitamin E is most efficacious in sows and piglets, given that the piglets have low serum levels at birth and therefore dependent on sow feed level of vitamin E. Also, we know that there is a rapid piglet immunity or piglet immune system development at this stage, and also at weaning, a decline in serum levels, especially that the animal is undergoing series of a stressful event during this period. In this study, this clearly shows that feeding late gestating and lactating cells with higher levels of vitamin E improved the humoral immunity and antioxidant capacity in suckling piglets. Another important component that is not typically added in pig diets is vitamin C. So this is an important antioxidant vitamin that can increase macrophages activity, and also it plays an important role in recycling of vitamin E. And lastly, we have the selenium. So selenium is an integral part of selenoproteins such as glutathione peroxidase, and this is involved in regulation of oxidative stress, as well as interplays with vitamin E in innate and adaptive immunity development. It is also important to note that the source of selenium is important to be considered, as organic sources have shown to have better bioavailability compared to inorganic sources. So, to evaluate the combination of these different non-competing components, I will be presenting several internal data that show promising results in improving immunity of piglets. So in a trial in France, newly weaned pigs were assigned to standard diet or with immunity booster supplementation with or without subjecting them to stressful condition. So the parameters measured include oxidative burst, and oxidative burst results in extracellular killing of pathogens. And so this shows that pigs that were subjected to standard diet had reduction in oxidative burst when subjected to stress, but this was not the case for pigs that were fed with immunity booster. Also, lysozyme, which is an antimicrobial peptide that attacks bacterial cell walls, is also significantly enhanced in stressed pigs that were fed with the immunity booster for 2 weeks prior to the stress. And so this means that the immunity booster was able to improve resistance to stress in weaned piglets. So another trial was conducted in a research facility in China, where healthy pigs were fed with a control group or with one of the 2 different levels of the immunity booster. So this result shows that the standard and high inclusion rate of immunity booster increased the monocyte count in the blood of pigs for 42 days post-weaning. And pigs fed high inclusion rate of immunity booster has higher granulocyte counts in blood 42 days post-weaning. Monocytes and granulocytes are white blood cells that fight off infections. And so therefore, this means that the immunity booster modulates the immune response in weaned pigs, confirming the previous results that has been done in France. So growth performance were also evaluated in the same set of healthy pigs, whereby the standard inclusion rate of the immunity booster increased average daily gain of healthy pigs by 5% in the last 2 weeks post-wean period and by 4% improvement overall. Also, the pigs that were fed with standard immunity booster were more than 1 kilogram heavier on day 42. So this means that there are still improvements expected in terms of immunity and growth performance of pigs when supplemented higher levels of these micronutrients, even in healthy and unchallenged pigs. 3 points I would like to make as a take-home message. So first, defense against viral disease incursion is a holistic approach beyond biosecurity. Second, disease risk in feeds and water, as well as improving the pig immune system, are important factors to be considered in addition to strong biosecurity measures. So this can include use of feed mitigant, as it improves feed safety and protects against viral infections. Treatment of water can effectively kill viruses such as ASF virus. And a multi-component nutritional approach can improve pig immunity against viruses and other diseases. Lastly, these nutritional interventions are important tools to be considered for pigs to better defend themselves against current and future viral diseases. And as we know, ASF will be with us for a long time. More solutions are likely to come available for us to help us fight this ongoing battle. But for now, these are 3 new tools that we can use to fight off ASF and other diseases. And with that, thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
The overuse and misuse of antibiotics in animal farming and human medicine is leading to antimicrobial resistance, or AMR. AMR is flagged as one of the major issues for humanity, and unless tackled, it will become the single leading cause of death worldwide by 2050. Animal farming uses a significant amount of the world's antibiotics that are deemed medically important for human health. Much of this use is for antibiotic growth promotion and prophylaxis. At DSM, we advocate the replacement of antibiotic growth promoters and limiting the need for their prophylactic use in animal farming, thereby helping reduce the prevalence of AMR. We've done this by working closely with our customers over many years to develop a suite of nutritional ingredients that help improve the gut health of animals. For example, our novel enzyme technology, Balancius, breaks down bacterial cell debris in the gut, material that is commonly found in all animals, leading to more efficient use of feed and improved animal health. Whereas swine farmers routinely use our Vivo Vital solution to ensure a more favorable gut microflora balance and reduce digestive disorders. With our nutrition and health solutions, we are leading the way in limiting the prevalence of antimicrobial resistance. If not us, who? If not now, when? We make it possible.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Abelilia Messina, for teaching us piglets survive by increasing their immune system. So now let's prepare ourselves to hear and to listen to our fourth speaker, who is sponsored by Zoetis.
Good afternoon, everyone, to our partners from the swine industry. I am Syra Angeles from Zoetis Philippines, and it is an indeed pleasure to introduce the next speaker. He graduated with a Doctor of Veterinary Medicine degree from the University of the Philippines last 1998. He started his swine profession in sales with Pfizer Animal Health last 2002, wherein he grew his career in providing consultative and technical selling. He transferred to technical services last 2006 due to the growing technical needs of swine farmers. The primary role was to guide farmers in achieving optimum health and production efficiencies. Promoted to Senior Field Veterinarian last 2008 and has now supported Zoetis. He is Zoetis Certified Technical Trainer and a technical expert in the internal individual pig care program. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Dr. Francis Xavier Bonto.
Good day, everyone, and thank you, PCSP, for this 25th Pinoy Port Challenge. This is indeed a good platform to get updates and continuing education on the swine industry. It has been 2 years since we were hit by ASF, and almost all discussions evolve around it. But we should be turning also our keen eye on keeping PRDC in check, or porcine respiratory disease complex, as this gives rise to increased mortality in farms. In September 2019, the government confirmed through PCR that ASF was indeed creating havoc in farms in Montalban, Rizal. And since then, it has impacted our inventories in a declining mode. From 2019 to 2020, 7% decline. And from 2020 to 2021, there's already a 17% decline. And if you get the trend from 2019 to 2020, there is a 24% decline in inventory. And this obviously contributed to the low supply of local pork. For the latest ASF zoning status, we could still see our islands in red, meaning being infected. And the dilemma here also is that the central Luzon and Calabarzon areas, which are heavy producing swine in Luzon, is also heavily hit, with central Luzon having a 77% decline and 54% decline in the Calabarzon area. On a good note, there are areas that indicates gray, meaning that there is no ASF reports for the last 180 days. And we continuously pray that this would continue so that we'll be able to go with repopulation strategies. And there's opportunities really for farms in these green zones, which are really not affected. The low local pork supply poses both opportunity and pressure for the remaining farms. Opportunity because as an existing farm, you have a chance to continuously supply the pork chain, whereas those heavily hit, we had to start all over again. At the same time, there is still a good demand for local pork over other sources, such as imported. It is also a pressure on the side of the farmers because aside from the opportunity to provide local pork, the softening of farm gate prices and the increase in input cost thins their margin. So there is a pressure on it, and there's a pressure also to contribute with the local pork supply. But really, the idea here is we know that ASF is maybe here to stay for some time. So those farms that are existing should be looking at controlling mortalities. So this talk of ours for this afternoon would involve lowering the cases of mortality so that farms with their genetic inputs would be able to optimize the output of these genetics such as fast growth, good FCR, and good litter size. Combine all of this, when you reduce mortalities, hopefully we would be able to contribute more on this dwindling local supply of pork. Imagine in this graph a 2-point increase in mortality. It has a great impact on the number of heads, at the same time on an economic side. A 1,000 sow level producing 1,650 pigs per month, an increase in 2 points in pre-wean would add 33 heads. An increase in from 4 to 6 or just 2 points would add another 30 heads. So these values here are on top of the mortality set, which is more or less acceptable from the Picard standpoint. But all of these, when you combine, if this is a case of a one farm, that would be an equation of opportunity loss of 715,000. If you look at it on the inverse side, if the farm is suffering from this one, and all strategies are done also to reduce mortalities, then this would not be an opportunity loss, but more of a gain and profit. So this just points out that we really need to control mortalities as this pulls down profitability. Zoetis Technical Services Group over the years has been collating data from those farms that are requesting support in diagnostics. Unfortunately, we were not able to sustain the collation from 2015 and up. And 2019 and 2020 was really a challenge because almost all farms does not allow us to go inside, do diagnostics, and collect samples. So what this diagnostic report shows that there is a seasonality distribution of our clinical cases that were presented to us. Most of them fall in this yellow pie, which is the second half of the year. And if you see, there is really a trend over the past earlier years that we have done compilation. It still represents that second half of the year is most of the cases where we encounter them. For the profile of these clinical cases, we are seeing that bulk of them are more on respiratory. So that is from 2011 to 2013, it exhibits the same with 2014. Now, comparing it with this year, although we only have compiled 12 cases versus 92 of 2014, this side of the graph just illustrates the same over the years, that respiratory cases really is a contributor in the problems of the farms. We have seen that the distribution of these cases are more on the orange one, the respiratory ones, and they are more or less found on the nursery and grower stages. There were lower cases of enteric diseases that were consulted with us, and that represents the same in the 2011 and 2013 data. For the meager 12 cases we had just encountered this year, we can see also that there are low enteric cases presented to us and more of respiratory. So this respiratory, although it's really 2 cases only, so 2 cases of enteric and 12 cases all in all, we have a distribution equally of nursery and grower stages of respiratory challenges. We have seen over the years that when it comes to the viruses, the PRRS and PCV2 were the ones leading the pack. And most of the cases we have encountered are concentrated in nursery and grower stages. So really in amidst ASF, we should be always on the lookout for these PRDC cases. Usually they are found concentrated in the nursery and grower stages. Specifically in the first 2 weeks after wean in the nursery stage, in the first 2 weeks upon transfer in the grower stage. Because of the stress this activity brings about to the pigs. For 2021, with really low collection cases, we have seen that PRRS is still leading the pack, followed by flu, and then for PCV was also isolated. For PRRS, both nursery and grower stages are being almost equally contributed, and so was flu, but PCB is more on, we are seeing on a grower side. Interestingly, this case also shows that compared to the 12 cases, there are only 2 cases here on a singular basis. We are seeing that number one, PRDC from the acronym itself, porcine respiratory disease complex, it really comes not just one viral or 2 viruses, but with other secondary infections. For the nursery cases, we have seen a contribution of PRRS with Mycoplasma aerugines and Bordetella bronchosectica. We have seen another one with PRRS and swine influenza virus with Bordetella and strep. And another one, almost the same, but Haemophilus parasulis was there. For grower cases, we have seen almost similar, PRRS and Mycoplasma aerugines. Some has swine influenza or swine flu, and some has Pasteurella multocida. But in general, we have seen for 2021, I think what plays a collaborative disease here is more on PRRS, swine flu, and Mycoplasma aerugines. For co-infections with these viruses, we have seen that Haemophilus leads the pack. Haemophilus, as we know, is an opportunistic bacteria, and we have seen most of the time that they are the ones which have co-infection with PRRS and PCV. If you look at the row for PRRS, there is a 20% time that we were able to isolate singularly, but more or less 80% of the time it has a co-infection. So what does this equate for us? Even diagnosticians, we really have a difficult time in controlling multifactorial diseases compared to just one infection in the piggeries that we go to. For bacteria, over the years, we have seen that 83 hits were really there for Haemophilus and strep. And also, there are some cases of Pasteurella. Although APP has lower cases in bacterial isolates, because we know the nature of APP, we will not have time to isolate them because pigs will already die. So I think this also shares a spot in the first 2 or 3 bacterial co-infections. We know that porcine respiratory disease complex is really being hammered in the second half of the year because of rainy season and the third quarter syndrome, which in feed toxicity can lead to immune suppression. But our talk would really be aimed at with ASF mitigation risk the farm has been doing, because we would like to really lower down the risk of ASF going in. They also have contributed on the downside the increase of PRDCs. A big flow in traffic in farms, specifically those multi-site, was experienced. In farms that have two sites wherein the grow-out site was being hit for ASF, then they cannot move pigs. Then PRDC becomes a concern. Another concern that has being seen here is if a province or municipality LGU locks down the area because of cases of ASF, then those farms that still have pigs cannot move it out. Then it creates a problem of pig flow, leading to the PRDC problem once again. Some farms had really limited people movement. However, this also had contributed to some PRDC cases, such as limited entry of caretakers, meaning less cleaning. And that involves increase in ammonia, in an increase in load of pathogen in the pens. There is also a limited entry of people. That means low incidences of injecting pigs that are starting to get sick. Thus, PRDC flares up. To some extent, some farmers have really reduced vaccination, and we know that from the previous slides, PRRS was there, swine influenza was there, which are most vaccines requested by farms if they can remove already. So that includes swine flu, PRRS, and PRV. Then also the mitigation risk for ASF included immediate culling. So an off-feed pig would not have time to be treated and no more diagnostics has been done. So this strategy would not allow the farm to identify what are the other causes. So that's the time that when PRDC also increases. On the extreme, there are also farms that really reduce their medication heavily, reduce also the vaccination because of fears, especially for injectables, injectable medicines, and through the vaccines, because they're given through injections. So this risk, although was good for ASF, but also increased the flare-up for PRDC. So PRDC during ASF times, we have seen that these factors are really complicated things more. For example, we know that the multifactorial contribution for PRDC is really there, but if you remove medications, reduce vaccinations, then definitely there is a impact on PRDC flaring up because of multifactorial causes. Then there is a point of complications with varying serotype, genotype, and strains. This would be more focused on PRRS with the North American and European strains, Haemophilus with 13 known serovars, PCB with increasing and shifting to PCB2D variants. Then there's another challenge without diagnostics, those challenges that show similar clinical manifestations but with several causes. This is more case in point for Haemophilus, only to find out that it's not Haemophilus but more of strep or even Mycoplasma hyoinis. Which brings to the point for the fourth point, the reemergence of Mycoplasma hyoinis. I place question mark here because it is only in the recent years we were able to identify this through laboratory works. So I do not know if this has been existing prior to the 5 years that we've been collating data. So In the next few slides, mentioning cases, this would just elucidate the mitigating ASF mitigating factors that were discussed previously and how it impacted the increase of PRDC cases in farms. This discussion is only aimed in showing what happened. It does not move forward in discussing the resolution of the cases. For this case, case report 1, we have seen the idea of multifactorial. As you have seen, there are viruses, bacteria, mycoplasma. Second, the idea of strain differentiations. So for PRRS, you have North American strain was isolated in the 28 and 50-day-old sample, while PRRS European strain were isolated in the 78 and 96-day-old samples. Haemophilus was isolated and serotype yielded 5 or 12, 7 and 8. Although I have not encountered yet discussion on efficacy of antibiotics with different serotypes for Haemophilus. But obviously, there is an impact with the vaccines you're using in controlling. As mentioned by Swine Diseases Manual, there is a increased efficacy if the serovar or serotype of the vaccine is almost similar to the field challenge. It is not placed here for PCR for Mycoplasma pneumoniae, but we obtained also ELISA in this case, and we have seen almost all samples were positive, indicating a role being played by Mycoplasma in flare-ups of PRRS and swine flu. We also obtained bacterial isolation, and as you know, the part of multifactorial really plays again the role because we have isolated Haemophilus, Streptococcus, and Bordetella. So this case really exemplifies all those mitigating factors where ASF had really contributed. For case 2, we have seen also a multifactorial disease, an elevation of in mortalities in 13 to 14-week-old animals to 10 to 11% with thumping and coughing. Upon diagnostics, it is multifactorial because by PCR, PRRS, swine flu, and mycoplasma, higher Hemis was detected. Bacteria obtained was Pasteurella. So it again points out to the idea that it's multifactorial and the re-emergence or emergence of mycoplasma, higher Hemis. It was subjected for antibiotic sensitivity test. The isolate bacteria was Pasteurella. So it only reflects, the result only reflects for Pasteurella. We should not generalize that because the farm example is resistant for fluorphenicol that it would not use fluorphenicol anymore because all of these results, be it sensitive or resistant, only refers to Pasteurella. We must also take note that some antibiotics here, like colistin, which is poorly absorbed in the gut, has no effect systemic. So that means even if it's sensitive, you will not use that against Pasteurella. Case 3 and case 4 indicates the idea of multifactorial. There are Haemophilus, PCB, and PRRS. Same here at the bottom, the case 4, but also this also involves the idea of several genotype or serotypes. Haemophilus serotype 5 and 12 was isolated here. PCB2 type D was isolated, and so was the case 4. So the idea here is that there are multifactorial causes, and then the serotype and genotype plays also a role in flaring up of PRDC. Another case involving growers. with an elevated mortality. At around 100 to 130 days old, they are seeing this peak of mortalities. So when we tested, it turned out that involvement was more on the genotype. So PCV2D was isolated. As we know, most commercial vaccines contain PCV2A. Case report 6 shows again the multifactorial causes and the clinical manifestation at one glance, especially if you don't do diagnostics, you would just conclude that this is a possible case of Haemophilus or strep, where in fact when we did the diagnostics, it turned out that what causes the polyserositis and pericarditis is more on Mycoplasma hyoinis. Although PCR positive also for PRRS and Bordetella also plays a role in this case. So going to the idea of serobars, we know that from Rapp Gabrielson in 1992, they were able to pin down the virulence of different serobars, but at the same time points to the idea that the control via vaccination using the vaccines with matching serotypes in the field is more effective than those that does not match your field concerns. So for PCV, we know this from Iowa State University Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory results that increasing of PCV2 type D is on the rise. And what we did on the Zoetis side is we partnered with Epivax to show and study the epitope comparison of PCV2 vaccines versus the field isolates. This is what happened when they collected 161. These small numbers are 161 field isolates and clustered into 2A, 2B, and 2D clusters. And then different types of vaccines were analyzed, T-cell responses of this, and compared with the epitopes of the field virus isolated. For the 2A clusters, you could see that there is not much difference between the orange, blue, and gray. But when we go to the PCV2 clusters, the orange one scores goes up because this is 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. The scores go up. This indicates the nearness of the face or the epitopes of the orange vaccine for those of the field isolates. When they were compared with PCV2D clusters, the orange one with vaccine with 2A and 2B inside was more homogeneous to the field isolates rather than the 2A vaccine alone. So this may play a part in increasing the depth of coverage for the vaccine and the field challenges. So take-home message, ASF may be here to stay. So we know biosecurity should be more improved, and we should be also looking at efficiencies in terms of reducing PRDC because these are very much related to mortalities. Especially now that our supply of pork is very low, the local supply is low. So in the end, we should be always looking at the PRDC, control mortalities, and making every pig count. So you go back to the basics of diagnostics, review records, walkthrough, and necropsy. We have to utilize laboratories to confirm our diagnostics because some diseases exhibit the same clinical sign, but they are different causative agents. Consider the impact of different genotypes of diseases. Review the pig flow, wound management, and ventilation. We should be also looking at the control of these three triumvirate diseases because numerous studies already indicate that they interplay with each other. Utilize a tool from Zoetis wherein the individual pig care advocates early disease diagnostics, and prompt intervention. And obviously, then last would be for the farm side to act fast, strategic, and decisively. So with that, thank you very much for your attention and have a good day.
Today, with thousands of dedicated colleagues reaching out to customers around the world, Zoetis brings a singular focus on animal health to the quality products, services, and solutions it offers veterinarians and livestock farmers. Because the world depends on animals, those who care for them can depend on us. We're Zoetis. For animals, for health, for you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bonto, for showing us doing porcine respiratory disease complex, and so that we can get our pigs to market. So again, I would like to remind our audience to write your questions in our Q&A boxes. And so now we are now going to our last but not the least speaker for this afternoon, and by BioChip.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, to all the Pinoy Pork Challenge participants and to my fellow veterinarians. Good afternoon. I'm honored to introduce to you our next speaker for today, my colleague from BioCheck. I am Lu Arucan, by the way, your regional product specialist here in Asia. So our distinguished speaker for today graduated the Bachelor of Arts from Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa. And he continued his Doctor of Veterinary Medicine also at Iowa State University. He started his career way back in 1991 as a swine research assistant for the College of Veterinary Medicine from the same university, and continued into mixed animal practice at the veterinary clinics also in Iowa. For 3 years, he served as the director of the Veterinary Science National Pork Producers Council, after which he joined the USDA Office Veterinary Services as the Senior Veterinary Medical Officer. In 2013, he became the Assistant Vice President for the Science and Technology at the National Pork Board. And by 2015 until July of this year, 2021, he became the Senior Vice President for Science and Technology and as a Chief Veterinarian for the National Pork Board. Our speaker is also a current member of several prestigious professional organizations like the American Association of Swine Veterinarians, American Veterinary Medical Association, Iowa Veterinary Medical Association, the United States Animal Health, USDA African Swine Fever Technical Working Group, USDA African Swine Fever Slaughter Plant Working Group, and a lot more organizations. He also did several projects where he shared his vast experience and technical knowledge in different professional organizations, like he worked as a representative for the U.S. pork industry for Global Porcine Epidemic Diarrhea Working Group. He was a member of the U.S. delegation to the Codex Committee and Food Hygiene, a member of the Cross-Sector Response Team and Working Group for the Influenza, member of the AASVPRS Task Force, and a lot more projects he actively participated in. He had been actively invited to give presentations also on organized technical meetings for the U.S. and Canadian pork producers, the U.S. and Canadian Veterinary Associations meeting for domestic and foreign state and federal government departments and agencies, and a lot of colleges of veterinary science and medicine. You may also be interested in some of his published papers, which we can easily find in several scientific journals, publications like the Journal of Swine Health and Production, the Professional Animal Scientist, Microbial Food Safety in Animal Agriculture, the Journal of Veterinary Diagnostics Investigation, to name a few. So without further ado, I would like to present to you our current U.S. Swine Business Unit Director for BioCheck. Thank you very much for agreeing to be with us in a very short notice. My colleague, Dr. David Pyburn. David?
Hello, my name is Dr. David Pyburn. I'm the U.S. Swine Business Unit Director for BioCheck, and I've been asked here to speak today on the role of diagnostics in protecting our swine herds. So we're going to talk a little bit about the overall importance to diagnostics, to animal health, and the product that we produce. And then also I'm going to focus in on diagnostics and appropriate diagnostics and the appropriate use of diagnostics for African swine fever, since that is a topic that is very much at hand for all of us today. I want to thank the Philippine College of Swine Practitioners for inviting me to speak here today, and I'm really glad to be a part of the Pinoy Pork Challenge this year. So in today's presentation, what are we going to talk about? We're going to go over a little bit about why diagnostics are important, why they're important to the industry, why they're important to veterinarians, and why they're important to our clients as well. We're going to show how we build the evidence towards a diagnosis. This is all not just about in-lab diagnostic testing. You have to build between the history of the herd, the clinical signs you're seeing on the farm, other evidence on the farm of disease that the veterinarian will investigate, as well as diagnostics done at a lab. Build all of that together to come towards your final diagnosis. And then, as I said, we will also focus on ASF diagnostics as well today. So the importance of diagnostics. Really, when you talk about diagnostics, there are two main uses. One is testing of sick pigs or testing of population health, testing of sickness within a herd to determine what is causing that disease, or what multiple entities in many cases are causing the overall clinical signs and the disease which is seen in that herd. Using diagnostics in this way leads to the formation of a treatment and prevention plan, both for the individuals that are sick and also then for the herd as well. And using diagnostics enables us to be more precise and much more effective with our treatment rather than just taking a shotgun type approach. The other main use of diagnostics is herd surveillance. This can be done to determine the presence of disease. It can be done to verify the absence of disease in a herd, or it can be done to verify the stability of a herd. And really, when that's something new for surveillance, or relatively new for surveillance. And when you're talking about stability, a lot of times what we're talking about is with PRRS, porcine reproductive respiratory syndrome. And what we want to show is that that herd is stable. We know we're not going to get the virus out of the herd. We know the vaccines are only of limited use within the herd. So what we try to do is maintain the PRRS virus that we have within our herd and maintain it at a subclinical level. And doing surveillance can show that, in fact, we still have that within our herd. We have that within populations within our herd, making sure that the disease-causing agent especially remains in those breeding females so that they can pass on maternal immunity to the baby pigs. And then we see much less clinical PRRS within a herd that way. Surveillance can often show the presence of subclinical disease entities. And here we can talk about PRRS again, or porcine epidemic diarrhea virus, PED. Sometimes we just don't even know these disease entities are in the herd. And we do routine surveillance, and we may find that, in fact, we have viruses present that we did not know were present within the herd. Other times we're doing surveillance to prevent disease or catch it very early upon entry into the herd. Again, that's another use of surveillance, trying to keep our herds overall more healthy, make sure that if we do have disease come into the herd, we find it early, we have to treat fewer populations within the herd, and we get it under control much more quickly through this routine herd surveillance. And then herd surveillance is also used for eradication programs, and these can be both voluntary and regulatory. A voluntary surveillance and eradication program might be one that a producer would undertake for mycoplasma, trying to work mycoplasma out of their herd. A regulatory one, a great example of that is our past success here in the United States with eradicating pseudorabies virus or Judski's disease from the commercial swine population. Again, through doing vaccination, through herd surveillance, through removal of animals that are found to be positive within the herd, we were able to eradicate pseudorabies here in the United States commercial swine population using herd surveillance. So what are some of the diagnostic tools at the diagnostic lab? As I said, remember, this is only one part of the overall diagnostics, but I do want to focus in a little bit on this. Some of the classic tools you can see there on this slide, agglutination testing. That's a very old test, but still very effective, especially for diagnosing something like brucella. And it's really just adding antibody to an antigen, a possible antigen possible antigen specimen. The formation of antibody antigen complexes then results in visible clumping on the test, and you have a positive. Indirect fluorescent antibody test. This is just detecting the presence again of an antigen, a viral antigen, by adding specific antibodies to a specimen, often a serum sample. Again, there's the added antibody is actually tagged with a fluorescence, and if it remains within if it binds to the antigen and remains within the sample, then you'll see a color change. Serum neutralization. This is a serologic test to detect the presence and magnitude of antibodies within that are against a specific virus. So you have an idea of what virus or viruses may be causing disease in this case, and you then test to detect whether there's antibodies against that virus using serum and this serum neutralization test. Complement fixation is a test to detect, again, specific viral antibodies in serum, especially used in more acute infections. ELISA, one of the very classic and very highly used tests types out there, the enzyme-linked immunoassay, or ELISA. You can test for either antigens, so direct testing for the virus, or for antibodies against a specific virus using blood or serum samples. Very classic test, one that's used very often, and one we're going to talk about more as we get into the ASF part of this discussion as well. And then virus isolation, often seen as the gold standard of testing, and this is really using culture media to grow up the virus within the lab. Alternatively, you can do bacterial isolation as well. You can use different culture media, grow up the bacteria and isolate the bacteria within the lab as well. Again, showing that the bacteria or the virus were present within the sample that was sent in, so could be a potential cause of clinical disease within the herd. Some of the newer tools and technologies that we've seen come into the veterinary diagnostic labs within the last 20 to 25 years, immunohistochemistry, or IHC. This is using stained antibodies that you add to a specimen, and if you get the color reaction, then you know that those antibodies bound to viral specific antigens within the sample, and you know that virus was then present in the sample itself, so you have a positive for that virus. Polymerase chain reaction probably now has potentially overtaken ELISA as the most common used diagnostic test in a diagnostic lab. And what a PCR, or a polymerase chain reaction test, does is it through a process, it amplifies genetic materials that are present within the specimen or samples that were sent in by the veterinarian or the producer. It amplifies them to millions and even billions of copies of this genetic material, which is DNA or RNA. And then you can, through a process of running it through what they call a thermocycler, you can then determine whether you've actually had the DNA or RNA present in your specimen. If you have the DNA or RNA present in your specimen, you know then that you had the virus, or at least part of the virus, in the specimen, so you can diagnose that, in fact, the virus was in the specimen. Remember, though, one thing to think about with PCR is it will amplify, it will extract, and it will show the presence of either dead or alive genetic material. So if the virus was there and the virus has been removed by the immune system, but still parts of it remain, it will still show up as a positive on a PCR. So not always is the PCR actually telling us the virus or the disease-causing agent, but it is telling us what viruses were present. Whole genome sequencing, and this is just taking PCR detection to the next level, taking those genetic codes or pieces of those genetic codes that we were able to amplify and replicating those, and then putting them together and showing the genetic code for the actual virus or a portion of the genetic code for the virus that was present in the specimen. What we've seen with these newer tools and technology, and really with the ELISAs and other tools as we've gone through time, is we've seen an increasing specificity and sensitivity of veterinary diagnostics. Our diagnostics continue to get better every day as we add these new technologies and we improve the existing technologies. Now with PCR tests, we've got multiplexing possible. And what that means is we can take a PCR and we can test for multiple pathogens, 4 or 5 pathogens at a time. So what you may have is a respiratory panel for swine, where you pick the 5 most likely respiratory diseases or respiratory agents that would infect the pig and cause the clinical signs you're seeing, and you test for all 5 at once, so we can get an answer much more quickly as to what's actually present causing disease in that herd or in those animals. Labs continue to gain tools to make a quicker and more accurate diagnosis. That's helpful to us out in the field because that leads to better treatment decisions and better overall outcomes, and they're done quicker. They happen quicker out in the field that way. What's next for diagnostics? Where are we headed next? I'm going to speculate that maybe it's point of care diagnostics. And what I mean by that is that the next thing may be that we actually take these diagnostic tests down to the herd level, down to the farm level, and we're applying these tests and we're getting answers within hours to maybe even minutes of what we're seeing in the herd and what viruses or bacteria in this case that we have present within the herd where we're seeing the clinical signs. Again, just making diagnosis much more quickly so that we can get on with a better treatment faster. So what do I want to run? I see this, you see a disease in a herd, and what do I want to request, or what test do I want to have run? There's always that challenge out there of making sure you have the right specimen, the right sample that gets sent into a laboratory, a diagnostic laboratory. We still see today where samples are either mishandled, mispackaged, or even worse, not sent at all, and they're needed to get to that final diagnosis. We've got to make sure that we're talking with our veterinarians out in the field, our farmers on the farms, and our veterinary students in class, and make sure that we continue to hammer away on what are those right samples, what are those right specimens, dependent upon the clinical signs that you're seeing in the herd that need to be sent to that diagnostic lab so they can give you the best answer. And that best answer is going to come from the tests that they choose to run then. If they don't have the samples, they can't run the test. And then when you're out in the field, you get that answer back from the diagnostic lab, the data back from a diagnostic lab that shows what the test results were for the specimens you sent in. The great thing about diagnostic labs is that you can lean back on them to help you analyze that data. Veterinarians often do consult calls with diagnostic labs after they get this data back to get to a final answer, to be able to bounce the ideas off for what the actual final answer is when you take into account all of what you're seeing in the herd, all of what you're seeing in the animals, and all of what you're seeing in the data. How do we get to that final diagnosis? And it's done in consultation with those diagnostic labs. There are other things that need to be considered when choosing the right diagnostic test, especially when you're looking at emerging and notifiable diseases, which become very important for trade and regulatory issues within the country, and also animal movement issues. You've got to make sure that you've got the right test, a fitness for purpose test, or is what we call that, is the right test to test on the right samples for the right disease. You got to think about what's going on clinically in the herd. What's possible? What possibly could be causing this disease? And then think about prevalence too. Not only just herd prevalence of disease, but region, state, country prevalence of diseases. Is it likely that this herd could be infected with disease X or disease Y? What is the prevalence in my area? What is the prevalence in my country of that disease? Is that one that I would likely expect to be found on this herd? You got to understand too with the tests that there are false positives and there are false negatives. So sensitivity and specificity comes into play with these tests. They're not absolutely 100% always correct. Very often they are correct, but you still have to consider false positives and false negatives. And one last thing that we have to consider in our industry when we're running diagnostic tests is cost. We're still out there producing pigs, producing pork to make an economic living for the farmer. And so cost of tests does come into play when considering what tests to cost. If costs are completely out of line or extremely high, then that test is likely to be run less often or maybe not at all, at least for swine testing in diagnostic labs. Importance of diagnostics. We're going to continue on with swine producers and practitioners to deal with a variety of emerging and re-emerging and well-known diseases. Coming to that diagnosis, making that right decision regarding then your further treatment or prevention measures necessitates using the appropriate diagnostic tools, all of the tools, which include those on the farm the veterinarian has as far as his history that he gains from the farmer and also what he sees in clinical signs. We got to use all those tools. And over the years, as we can see, technology has been modernized and made better so that we've got new techniques and new sampling procedures that help us get to better answers on diagnostics on the farm. And those sound diagnostics then enable us to much more quickly have an effective treatment on the farm, avoid that longer term illness within a herd or within those individual pigs. If you think about not diagnosing disease and letting it go, or taking too much time to diagnose disease, then you start to think about an outbreak that becomes much larger within your herd that you're dealing with. Maybe it spreads regionally to other herds around the farm where you're at. Maybe from there it spreads throughout the state that you're in, and eventually maybe throughout the country. So early diagnosis can help to prevent or stop an outbreak of this size. So as we gain better diagnostics, as we gain quicker diagnostics, we're really working to make sure that all outbreaks, whether they're on a local level or a national level, are kept to as small as possible. Diagnostics are also, when you think about even beyond swine, they're essential tools for the overall health of domestic and wild animals. There are a number of diseases that can spread from pigs to other species, that can spread from pigs to people, or back and forth either way. So again, as you work to have quicker, more effective diagnostics and thus much more effective and quickly treat disease within a herd, you're helping to increase the health of overall, really all species, including humans. Diagnostics very quickly allow veterinarians to understand and manage herd health status. And as I said, they're essential for animal health authorities for the emergence of new disease. So you need to find that new disease quickly so it doesn't spread, and work towards either control or eradication of that new disease, whatever the choice may be. This is essential for those regulatory officials. Diagnostics, as we stated before, support public health. COVID-19 is a great example of this. COVID-19 looks like really doesn't infect pigs very well at all, but there are other species that it will infect. And those species then can pass that disease on to humans. Diagnostics have enabled us to know what those species are, do surveillance within those species for COVID-19. Diagnostics are useful in the fight against antimicrobial resistance. The much more quickly we get to an actual final diagnosis and the correct treatment, the less antibiotics we're going to use. And we're going to fight antimicrobial resistance by using fewer antibiotics that way and using the right antibiotics in the right situation. And then diagnostics can also play an important role in the testing of vaccines. ELISA tests especially can be used to check for an immune response post-vaccination. If we don't see what we expect as far as an immune response post-vaccination, well, then we've got to consider a couple of things. One, was the vaccine effective? And two, did the vaccine actually get into pigs? And I have run into situations in the field where that has occurred, where pigs were said to have been vaccinated, but then the labor on the farm actually didn't get them vaccinated. So diagnostics are important to be able to check the effectiveness of our preventative measures, especially vaccines. So as we build towards a diagnosis, it's always the veterinarian that has that final responsibility for making that final diagnosis and making those ultimate recommendations concerning the management of swine health problems. The veterinarian is going to use all the tools that they have available, including that diagnostic lab and those testings that were done at a diagnostic lab, and the consultation with the diagnostic lab to come to that final diagnosis. The other thing, when you think about diagnostics too, or diagnostic labs and their importance, yeah, we've talked about them being able to perform the testing, and we've talked about them providing a consultation service for the veterinarian to get to that final diagnosis. But one other thing that diagnostic labs are important for is dissemination of current disease issues, and then also research on current disease priorities. There's a lot of research that's done in diagnostic labs. and they know based on their caseload what we're seeing as far as disease issues out in the field. So they're doing research on those most important priorities to the industry at that time. They're also at the same time forewarning practitioners based on data that's coming through their lab as they tabulate monthly and yearly diagnostic information. They're letting practitioners and they're letting the industry know, hey, this is the disease that we're seeing out there right now. These are the most popular diseases in your area, in your region, or in the country. This is what you need to be on the lookout for. This is what you need to work to prevent. So diagnostics had that kind of that lighthouse or that beacon role out there with practitioners and with the industry. So let's talk in particular about ASF diagnostics quickly. Y'all know what ASF, I'm sure what it is. It's a septicemic hemorrhagic disease of pigs. It's an extremely complex virus that's causing African swine fever. And right now, as we sit here today, there still is no vaccine available. A lot of folks are working on it. We're getting closer, but we still don't have a vaccine available. It was endemic in Africa for a long time, but now we've seen it invade Eastern, a small portion of Western Europe, Asia, and the Caribbean region most recently, as it continues to spread globally. Validated ASF diagnostic techniques are available for confident diagnosis of ASF. That's the good news here. It's really a combination test. You really need to use both the PCR and the ELISA, and I'm going to show you why here shortly, as you're looking for both the actual virus itself and then looking for antibodies to the virus. And combining these two tests together gives you a complete picture of a herd or a region, state, or national situation with ASF virus. So you can see both early infection and late in, and then you can also see later in the infection process the antibodies through the ELISA. So just a quick rundown of what this of African swine fever can look like, and to remind you too that it can often mirror what classical swine fever or hog cholera can look like. A lot of the signs are the same between the two. I'm not going to run through each of those clinical signs there in front of you, but what you do see is that it's really a septicemic, a complete system disease of the pig, where we've got multiple hemorrhaging and petechia throughout the pig, and multiple clinical signs that can be seen with both African swine fever and classical swine fever. Ultimately, it very often ends up in death, and sometimes very sudden death of the pig. Some of the most common ASF clinical signs: fever. You get this purple to red blotchy skin lesions, again, due to hemorrhaging. As I said, sudden death can be very common within a high number of pigs. And then vomiting, sometimes there can be blood in the vomit, and then also bloody diarrhea. It's a septicemic disease of pigs, which causes multiple clinical signs. It really is one of the most devastating viruses for our pigs. So when you're doing ASF diagnosis and you're working towards control of disease, containment of this disease, or eradication of this disease, you've really got to use, as I said, both the PCR and an ELISA test to be able to do appropriate diagnostics. You want to be able to detect through the PCR ASF specific antigens, and you want to or actual DNA of the ASF virus, and then through ELISA you want to be able to detect antibodies later in the infection process. And I'll show you on a chart here shortly what that looks like. The OIE recommended test for virus detection, for actually finding the virus itself, or virus isolation, that can be sometimes cumbersome and does take a long period of time. Fluorescent antibody tests, and then the one that's chosen by most is the PCR assays. For the detection of ASF antibodies, the OIE prescribes use of an ELISA for antibody screening, and it really is a screening test. It's not something you're going to confirm a diagnosis with. You're going to screen with this, looking for antibodies, and then you'll end up confirming through a longer process of virus isolation from those same samples. But you will call a positive a potential positive, or based on that ELISA screening and finding of antibodies. Serological assays are extremely low cost. They're very simple to run. There's very little need for specialized equipment, so these ELISAs can be run in many labs. For ASF diagnosis, you got to remember there is no vaccine currently available, as I said before, which means if you find any ASF antibodies in the pigs or in the specimens that you're testing, then you know at some point that pig had come into contact with ASF virus and has been infected with ASF virus, and their immune system has responded with building of these antibodies against that ASF virus. ASF antibodies generally happen very quickly, 17 to 21 days post-infection with ASF virus in pigs. And they'll persist for up to several months, or even in some cases in research, we've seen these antibodies persist for years. So they're a marker of a previous infection for the long term. Here's that chart I was talking about to show you how we use PCR and ELISA together for ASF diagnosis. On the left-hand side, you see day 0. That's the day of infection with ASF virus. The red line then shows you PCR results. The ELISA shows you, or the blue line shows you ELISA antibody test results. So very early in disease, as you can see, somewhere in that first 2 weeks, you're going to use that PCR, and you're going to detect the pathogen in that acute phase of the disease, or that early infection. And then later on, day 14 and beyond, you start to see the formation of ASF antibodies, and that ELISA is going to become positive, and it'll be positive for the long term, as you can see based on the chart we show above. So using both of these together allows you to do sampling within a herd, catch early infected animals, catch later infected animals. It covers all your bases as far as getting an ASF diagnostic that's appropriate. So what if I have no idea how long the virus has been present in a herd, or present in my region, my state, my country? That's often the situation we're in very early in disease investigation. And different pigs within the herd can be in very different stages of responding to ASF or being infected with ASF. Again, this leads to using both that PCR and the ELISA so that we see if we pick up ASF itself, ASF genetic material, or antigen to ASF, or if we picked up ASF-specific antibodies on the ELISA. A positive test, when we're looking at the PCR for the virus, indicates that the animals tested they basically were just undergoing that first 2 weeks of infection with ASF virus on those positives. A positive on the ELISA, or the antibody test, indicates that we've had some past infection, as I said. And these animals have recovered. They did not succumb to the virus, or have not yet succumbed to the virus. And in many cases, they'll remain seropositive for the rest of their life, and their antibodies will remain there as a marker for the fact that they were infected with ASF virus. Now, when we look at those ASF titers in these animals, sometimes we can get information about how long that virus has been in the herd, how long, based on how long that animal has survived with that ASF virus antibody within them. So in the end, again, if I stress any one thing here with ASF diagnostics, it's that a combination of techniques between detection of the actual virus, DNA material of the virus, or antigens of the virus, as well as antibody detection, are important. And that's, in most cases, that's the use of PCR testing plus ELISA testing for ASF diagnostics. I want to thank you today again. I want to thank the Philippine College of Swine Practitioners again for allowing me to speak here today. I want to thank you for your attention. My contact information there is on the right-hand side of this slide. If you'd like to follow up, please do contact me through either one of those means there. And thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Pyburn, for reiterating the importance of diagnostics as towards control and preventive measures for towards swine diseases. So for now, we are in our question and answer portion of our conference. I hope our audience have already typed their questions in the Q&A box. And so now let me have the first question to be directed to Dr. Goodell. Okay, Dr. Goodell, Krista Goodell. So the first question is, so we agree that something measurable can be improved. Can you help enlighten us on how to set a baseline criteria farm risk?
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, it's very important to start with a baseline, and I think baseline can come from different areas of the industry. So in the U.S., we can get our baselines from the National Pork Board publications. So in the Philippines, maybe there's an industry baseline. However, my caution is that if a farm is not achieving the standard baseline as it is, then it's unrealistic to start monitoring with that in mind. So in all honesty, I would baseline monitoring simply by documenting what you're currently doing on getting your pre-weaning mortality or your breeds, starting to put those type of charting, and again, statistical process control. But where you start then allows you to understand what your normal variation is, and then got that documented, you can understand and make changes to improve that.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Goodell. Now for Mr. Frio, overfat to Mr. Frio, yes, Mr. Frio, are overfat gilts, do they struggle in producing milk for pets in the future?
Yeah, in our experience, we had maybe around 50% of the fatter gilts will probably have difficulty in taking care of their young. So primarily what we see is that after 24, 48 hours, they run out of milk and there's some MMA happening. So yes, if it's not taken care of, and then it's going to be a huge problem. So we to prevent this from happening, we manage the body condition of the gilts during pregnancy.
Okay, thank you very much. So for Dr. Bonto, yes. Hello.
Yes, Doc.
Okay, so how many farms were diagnosed, and can they also provide the area where the majority of the farms are located when you did your PRDC diagnosis?
Okay.
So how many farms were
So,
diagnosed?
yeah, from the data we've shown, from 2011 to 2013, there were 238 farms, and then it went down from 2014 to around 80 farms. As I mentioned, from 2014 onwards, we were not able to compile already, and then the 2019 and 2020 ASF challenge really us in collecting samples. What I was able to present on the 2020 report was only 12 cases. So these cases are not a prevalent study, meaning as farms come and ask for assistance from us in terms of diagnostics, that's the time we help them. Basically, these cases are really with clinical signs, and this represents a nationwide collection. I really cannot pinpoint every farm, but most of or bulk of these cases really came from pig dense areas prior to ASF. So usually they came from Pangasinan, Pampanga, Tarlac, Bulacan. For Visayas, it's Cebu, and then for Mindanao, it's Davao and Jensan.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Dr. Bonto. Let's go to Dr.
Welcome.
Pyburn. Thank you. Dr. Pyburn, please.
Hi, Dr. Domingo. We didn't get to do a sound
Hi,
check earlier.
hello.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yes, I can hear you clearly. Okay, so the question is the USDA report that ASF modified live vaccine has shown good results 3 weeks post-vaccination in the is a promising start, signaling the possibility that we are near the availability of the ASF vaccine.
Yeah, actually just on a call yesterday with a committee for the United States Animal Association, Foreign Animal Disease Committee, and there was a presentation on there again by the two guys working out of Plum Island. That's where most of our research on this vaccine is taking place, Plum Island facility. And what they're reporting is now they have different candidates that look like good candidates, gene-deleted candidates for vaccine development. Several are in the works and have, I guess they've worked farther on efficacy and safety testing. They've gained, and where they gain the most headway with that is when they get an industrial partner, a private partner, a commercial partner to join with them and help to fund and then also work on that efficacy and safety testing. And several of those candidates are now in that efficacy and safety testing. I will be honest with you, I think a country like the Philippines or China or India or Vietnam, you guys are going to get to use these vaccines before we do here in the United States. For one, thankfully we don't need them yet, but I think that the licensing process here will slow them so much here. The United States will be a much slower process to get to it unless we have our emergency. But I think some of these candidates, we could see testing now for efficacy happening in some of these countries where we've got ASF right now.
Oh, all right. Okay. So we really hope that, of course, when something that starts, there will also be an ending. So we hope that the ASF will be mitigated soon. Okay, so let's go back to Dr. Goodell, Dr. Krista.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. So how can we adopt the PRRS herd classification?
Adopting the herd classification is really acknowledging that we will improve our health status and therefore our productivity and performance by knowing on a routine basis the health of our pigs and our sow farms. I think one of the key parts of the PRRS status is the monitoring to know that you're a status 2 or a status 3. And if you're unstable, so a status 1, that you're not controlling PRRS. And we know that if you aren't controlling PRRS, you're not in best performance and your health of your pigs is obviously compromised. So when we start monitoring on a routine basis, suddenly we gain actually more information from these diagnostics that helps us to make earlier decisions, smarter decisions sometimes. But that's really what we will commit to implementing PRRS control. And when you are able to tell what status you are, it's because you have that diagnostic information on a routine basis to say, I know because my testing is continuing to be negative on my weaned pigs, or my gilts are coming in negative, etc. So I think that's really the first start, and then you learn so much more. You can make decisions after that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So let me throw this question to Mr. Rolly Valientes. Okay, hello,
Good afternoon.
Hello, Dr. Rolly. The question is, to validate your trial in our local setting, could you please describe the heme absorption procedure done in the
Okay, thank you very much. Well, actually, part of the hem adsorption procedure is, well, actually, the last part of the procedure is taking 20 microliters of 1% RBC on each, and then we put it in the well. We incubate overnight, and then the following day, we check for the agglutination on the ring zone, and then we observe under the microscope. Now, the whole procedure is quite long, and I would suggest what we can do. One way is if you can type in your email address on the chat box where you post the questions, and we can send in fact, the publication itself on this. On the study that we did with ASF using this combination of benzoic acid and essential oils. The other thing that you can do is also to directly, for the one that asked this question, you can directly email harold.manuel@dsm.com, and we can send you the procedure in that publication. Thank you.
Okay, so as a continuation, one of the questions here is, what is the essential oil to combine with benzoic acid? What was the, and as continuation, I'm just curious, can monolaurin from coconut oil be a replacement as an essential oil to
Okay. Yeah, okay. Thank you for this question. So first, I think the first question was which essential oil
combine?
are in the used in the study. There are actually essential oil compounds that are extracted from thyme. So that's basically thymol, and the other one is from clove, which is the eugenol, and it also contains curcumin that's coming from Curcuma lunga, and also piperine, which is coming from black pepper or piper nigrum. Now, as to the question whether you can use monolaurin, of course, monolaurin is coming from lauric acid, and it's a saturated fatty acid. And if you they do say, or they cite that monolaurin does have antibacterial, antifungal, and even antiviral effects.
Antiviral,
But
yes.
yeah, but then you have to do the local study or the evaluation so that you can actually validate if it does have effect on ASF, for example, and then at what levels would you need it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's go to Dr. Yeah, Mr. Frio. Another question for you, Mr. Frio. Okay, so here there is a question wherein what diet can our audience who through these questions, what diet can I use as possible replacement to guilt diets if, for example, my feed delivery has not arrived yet due to, let's say, a typhoon or a volcano where my feed delivery has been canceled? So any replacement?
Uh, yeah, very good question. Mukhang taga-Taal to, no? I guess the closest one will probably be an early grower or a middle grower, yung mga 25 to 60 kilo pigs. Be wary, some of the grower diets kasi will be laced with ractopamine. So it negates our effort to build the back fat. So pag chromium, pwede pa tolerable. Pero pag ractopamine yan, medyo talagang mahirap mag-accumulate ang back fat ng gilts.
Oh, okay. So, okay, to Dr. Bonto again. Okay, Doc, can you share the economic significance of detecting porcine respiratory disease complex pathogens in terms of monetary value?
Okay.
Do you have any idea? How is
Well,
it? Yeah.
yes,
Mhm.
yes, Doc. Actually, it's difficult to generalize based on the presentation, but let me cite a specific case from what I have presented. So this 800 sow level farm has a mortality of around 80 to 90 heads of nursery. So the nursery was exhibiting, if you look at it on an eyeball estimate, eyeball diagnosis, you really think it's Haemophilus. So when we did the diagnostics for bacterial isolation and PCR, what appeared to cause this Haemophilus-like clinical signs was really more on Mycoplasma hyorenis. Other
Mhm.
bacteria isolated was Bordetella, and I think a PCR for PRRS went positive. My point here is if you don't do the diagnostics and you immediately treat the case with thinking that it's Haemophilus and you use, let's say, for example, amoxicillin, which is another drug of choice for Haemophilus, but it will not really work for Mycoplasma. So imagine if that farm did not invest in diagnostics, maybe around, I think that farm spent around 10,000. Imagine if that 90 heads continues to create havoc, then if it's a nursery pig, then most probably it's around 3,000 to 4,000. So you'd have around 40 to 50,000 losses versus a investment of diagnostics of around 10,000. And another way of putting it is more on in the amidst ASF, we really see farms that really don't do the diagnostics anymore and they just cull the animals.
Mm.
But what if that animal was not really affected by ASF and you just culled it? So one sow would be how much? Around 30,000. Then if you culled more, then that's the economic value of it.
Okay. Thank you.
You're
This
welcome.
direct. This question is directed to Doctor. Okay. Dr. Pyburn. Dr. Pyburn. Okay. Dr. Pyburn, what is the policy in the US if a farm was positive for ASF, and what are the strategic plans of the US so as not to experience the same wildfire like yeah, what will the US do in order not to experience the same wildfire like experience of the spread of the ASF?
Yeah, so I'm getting this question. I want to make it clear it's not my role as a biocheck
Mhm.
employee right now that I'm answering. I'm getting it because my past role with the industry and with the USDA,
Yeah, that's
and
true. Mhm.
I'm also a trained foreign animal disease diagnostician. So I do have experience with other diseases and our eradication steps that we've taken with other diseases, particularly in poultry and dairy cattle. I've worked on responses to those in the past. What's going to happen, what is happening actually right now, let's start with that. Right now, we've already got ASF and classical swine fever, CSF, surveillance that is here in the United States. That surveillance is done through, again, using diagnostic labs and the cases they get that are compatible or could be comparable to an ASF or a CSF outbreak. But we also do it in points of where pigs come together, like market barns, slaughter. We also do it in high-risk pigs, pigs that maybe are being inspected by USDA due to a high-risk feeding practice or something like that. We'll do sampling there as well for ASF and CSF. And then, of course, we've got our multi-million feral swine that exist here in the United States, predominantly in the southeast of the United States. And those animals, we're working to control those populations, and control of those populations means eradicating portions of those feral swine populations. And so we've got ready samples then from them as well to be able to put into the surveillance system. So we've got that surveillance system that USDA has had in place for a number of years here now, looking for that disease, looking to catch it early as it comes into the United States. If it does come into the United States, that is our plan, is to catch it very early, quarantine those farms where it is through diagnostics, show that in fact where we've got infection in those farms, in that region, in that state, maybe farther than that out too, hopefully not. And then the end of the quarantine will be an eradication, biosecurity cleanup process, and then eventually repopulation of those farms. If this does come to the United States, we will work to very quickly eradicate African swine fever. Two reasons to do that. The primary reason is this disease, as you guys know, you've got experience with it, is really a scourge for our pigs. It's an awful disease in the pigs themselves. And the other reason is trade, and what it does to your ability to trade pork throughout the globe when you're infected with African swine fever.
Thank you very much. Okay, so let's go back to Dr. Goodell. Okay. Dr. Krista, so this is a practical question actually. So how can you improve collection of saliva or oral fluids because some pigs don't chew the rope?
That's a question I've heard a lot, and actually we have done a lot of work with oral fluids. I've worked with Dr. Jeff Zimmerman for my PhD in oral fluids. So the thing about oral fluids we first have to understand is that when collecting in a pen of pigs, if you leave that rope hanging, you will really get between 75 and 80% of those pigs chewing in 15 to 20 minutes. That is sufficient to give you the high probability of detection. If people are worried that the sick pig is laying on the side and the sick pig may not come up and chew, the reality is that pig's already interacting with the other animals. It goes to the same nipple water. The other animals, they're always pushing it around. So there's a fear that it's not it's not a sustainable fear that you won't catch the sick animal, because that sick animal is already interacting with the do chew on the rope. So the next part is the young pigs. Young pigs actually need training. And so when we talk about weaned pigs, 3-week-old pigs, when they are, again, early weaned pigs are difficult. Pigs that are 28 days, closer to 30 days, they're so curious. If you put rope in the pen and you're patient, they will chew on it. When we started our project, we wanted to make sure that we collected a sample. So we actually prepared the pigs by training them, and we did that by tying a knot in another piece of rope, throwing it in the pen, and just letting the pigs nuzzle it, just push it around the pen and get used to having something that's different and chewing on it. And you kind of slowly bring that piece of rope to the penning that you're going to be hanging it on, and then you hang a fresh rope on that pen. Yes, that first time that you're training those weaned pigs might take an hour, just because you are getting them used to this new toy, and in essence, it's a toy. The next part of that is that it is really important when we talk about routine oral fluid sampling that we're sampling the same pens in a systematic way every sampling time frame. When you do that, then you're actually already using pigs that are used to collecting or depositing oral fluids. So when we have a large barn and we use 6 pens that are distributed systematically throughout that barn to get samples from all the different areas, by collecting in the same pens at each sampling time point, it's really just the first time point that might be a little bit difficult, because thereafter the pigs are used to it, they're comfortable, they actually enjoy it, and it's not a difficult situation. I am aware that people have been trying other, like whether it's apple juice or some type of spritzer, thinking that it entices the pigs. There are like apple juice does not impact the diagnostics, but there are some items that might. And so I would actually challenge us to try and give the pigs a little more time by training and let them be curious before going to the route of adding flavors to it. But again, if the flavors are not going to impact diagnostics, those can be used as a tool. Taking oral fluids from pigs in the farrowing house is difficult because they're just not curious, and they're also very dependent on mom, on the sow. So in neonatal pigs, you're not going to get oral fluids. The youngest pigs to probably try is 3 weeks old, either in the farrowing house or in the nursery. Dr. Linares' team has worked on family oral fluids to increase the amount of oral fluids that you're getting in the farrowing house if you want a sample at that time. The thing you need to understand about a family oral fluid is you're putting the rope closer to the sow, and so the sow is also contributing to get the piglets to chew. It is very effective. So she's training, everyone's curious, but the problem is there that if you're looking for low prevalence, she will dilute that sample. So maybe you just need to take more of those samples, but I'm sharing that because family oral fluids might be less sensitive because you are including the sow sample of the saliva, and so it's more dilute. But it definitely is makes it easier, so it facilitates the collection in those young pigs. It's all about training.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Krista. So let me call our next presenter for another question. Mr. Frio. Frio? Frio. Okay. Yes. Sir. Okay, so here the question is, with movement restrictions and lack of gilt supply, more being bred as gilt replacements. What are your recommendations in choosing market hogs as replacement gilts done to help improve prolificity of hogs?
All right, thank you for the question. I've heard that in a number of different countries as well. First from China, when they were hit for the first time, they communicated with me and asked the question, can I use my market pigs? Well, we have to evaluate. We haven't done that yet, but now we experience. Here's what we have done so far. If you are going to use that market female, so it's a market pig female, it's a typically large white landrace cross a Petrain and Duroc, and you plan to have a much just a progeny. If you're just going to use it as an F1 sow or kukunan mo lang siya ng terminal pigs, then the best would really is to mate them sa landrace na boar. You could use race boar to get advantage of litter size plus ADG. Ngayon, if you're going to produce F2 naman, kukunan mo siya ng gilts soon. What we do is yung marketing hog na ito na female, we mate them with semen para meron kang potential na gilts doon sa pool na yon. So, ang casing point lang dito is they will give you piglets. They will really give you wonderful piglets. But problem is they will run out of milk. So you have to prepare your milk replacers. You have to make sure you have creep feed ready. You have to make sure you have surrogate mothers para that you could use because talagang nawawalan sila ng gatas. It's like taking care of a pure line Duroc na dam or a pure line Petrain dam, 8 lang anak or 10 lang anak, then ang hirap maggatas because they're not really designed for that one. So these are yung experience namin in doing that. So cross mo with landrace or cross mo with large white, and then you have to take care of the piglet because pwede siyang mawalan ng gatas anytime.
Okay, thank you. That is a very practical tip. Okay, thank you very much. So let's go to Dr. Bonto. Dr. Bonto. Okay. Here, PCR cannot differentiate the vaccinal virus, especially if the attenuated live vaccine is used. So how can you explain the PCR positive reactors in pigs to PRRS and PCV2?
Okay, thank you for that question. It is true that you cannot differentiate the live and the killed virus using PCR. But we have to understand that we are collecting samples not for the sake of collecting samples, but we start with the clinical case itself. Kumbaga may problema yung farm. We analyze the case, we review the records, we walk through the farm and analyze what is the best diagnostics at that point in time. So example, if you're vaccinating for PRRS at around 3 weeks of age, tapos nandun yung problema sa 14 weeks of age and you do a PCR, then from your standpoint, may idea ka na mas less ang chance this is a vaccinal one. So the testings, reminder lang, the testings are not there as inverse diagnostics, meaning you diagnose using diagnostics. You start with your walkthrough, you review your clinical case, you do the walkthrough, you do some necropsy, and then from there, you do a plan out your diagnostics that you would know what would happen. For example, yun nga, you know that a 14-week-old pig positive for, let's say, a PCR for PRRS, there is a big chance that this is not already vaccinal. So you have to understand that hindi siya baliktad. Now we start with the collecting samples and diagnosing backwards. So yun yung doktora.
Okay, and here another question is, what is the status of the Zoetis ASF vaccine?
Okay, that's a good question, and your guess is just good as mine. So Zoetis is engaged in developing solutions. So I know we are developing one Zoetis brand, but as of now, we don't have locally here an update. So that's the recent thing I could say. The next one is, I'm sure you have heard of yung parang trial, but this trial that recently happened is not a Zoetis brand. It's not a Zoetis company. So whatever the result, it's an American company that even myself don't know the name. So kumbaga, the results of these trials are really limited to that company because they own the data. So kumbaga, hanggang doon lang yung pwede kong ibanggit sa question na yun, doktora.
Okay. So thank you very much po, Dr. Bonto. Now let's go
You're
to
very
the
much welcome.
Dr. Pyburn. Yeah, Dr. Pyburn. Okay, here the question is it practical to use ELISA at the early stage of ASF? And if yes, when would the best time and what would it be? What would the ELISA be? Competitive? And what are the pros and cons for the two types? Like, these are
Okay, I'm going to.
It's on ELISA.
Yeah, I'm not a diagnostician myself, so I'm not going to get down to cross comparing the different ELISAs.
Okay.
What I will tell you is this, and it goes back to that time period chart that I showed from time 0 of infection forward. And in the research today, what we see is that antibody to ASF is developing by sometimes a little earlier than day 17, but really day 17 to 21 is where we say we start to see antibody in the pig in those that survive, because in a lot of pigs we can see acute death before that day 17 with the ASF virus. But day 17 to day 21 is where we start to see those antibodies develop. And as we look out over time, those antibodies can remain there for months, and in some cases even years. So really, when you're looking at a little bit more than 2 weeks post-infection, or where you think day 0 was for infection on your pigs, then you can start to run those ELISAs and get results that would show those antibodies on your ELISAs.
Much, Dr. Pyburn. And I think this will be the last question from Mr. Rolly Valientes. Okay. Okay. Mr. Valientes, please could you answer the question on what is the virucidal blend from DSM already available in the Philippines? Is the inclusion or dosage rate for anti-effect?
Okay. Salamat po sa tanong, and that's a very good question. Yes, it's available. We can have it made available for you for specific use for the the one who asked the question. You can get in touch with our DSM representatives, and the question on the dose, because if you recall in the study that my colleague Dr. Jeru presented, we actually use in the pipestone trial we use 2 levels, 3 and 5. But in the ASF study that was conducted in China, we are recommending 5 kilos per ton of this blend. So feel free to contact us, and we'll be happy to serve your requirements. Thank you.
Okay, since our time is limited, thank you, by the way, thank you, Mr. Dr. Valdez. Since our time is limited, our panelists will post the answers to the questions that were not entertained in our website. Before we wrap up the Q&A of this session, we would like to hear some last few words from our speakers, beginning with Dr. Krista Goodell.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to say congratulations on an excellent session. I think the speakers and the topics have been not only excellent, but very topical for what Philippines is looking for to improve productivity. And I think that we're on the road to recovery for African swine fever. So all of the contacts that you're also learning, please reach out. We're really wanting to help, and really excited to get productivity improving for Philippines.
Thank you. Then let's have Mr. Frio. Okay.
Thank you very much, PCSP. Maraming salamat po sa lahat. Mga kababayan, this is it. Ito na yan. Whatever we do in the next couple of years, or yung gagawin natin today on the guilt side will matter in the next coming 2 years. So fail to prepare, prepare to fail. Simple lang.
Okay. Thank you. Then we go to Dr. Valiente.
Maraming salamat. In behalf of my colleague, Dr. Jerobelia Messina, we'd like to thank the PCSP for this opportunity to share. What we want to leave with you is there are 3 items that we can actually help in terms of controlling the spread of ASF. One can be via the feed, of course, using different organic acid blend and the essential oils, and then in the water. We have data to showing that this blend of acids can actually help in the control of ASF that can be that's contaminating the water or can contaminate the drinking water. And last but not the least is helping to improve and to boost the immunity of our pigs so that we can stay afloat in this very challenging time. Salamat po.
Thank you very much. How about Dr. Boto?
Yes, good afternoon. I recall in few years back convention, a foreign speaker said that it will be a matter of time that ASF will reach our shores. And we really were doubtful on his comments, but here we are. We are 2 years already suffering with the ASF. So as much as we know that biosecurity remains a tool against ASF since no vaccines yet are available, we should really be heightening our biosecurity practices and hindi na pwede yung babalik na farms na gaya ng dati. So talagang tatamaan uli. But even so, those farms that are surviving should not also look out for yung PRDC. They're singling it out because we know that PRDC would really contribute a lot in mortalities of pigs, and we badly need the local supply of pork. So thank you very much, Dr. Domingo.
Thank you, Dr. Bonto. Finally, we have Dr. Pyburn.
Dr. Domingo, I'm going to end by asking your audience to help me out. In a couple of weeks, I'm part of a panel here in the United States where we'll be speaking about ASF recovery in those countries that have most recently been infected with ASF. And of course, as we know, unfortunately, the Philippines is one of those countries. So you have my contact information. Please get in touch with me. I'd like to hear more about how it's going in the Philippines. What I've got right now is what I can see through the internet, through media. It looks like you are making good progress on the cleanup of ASF. I would say I would love to see the Philippines be that next country that completely cleans up ASF in this latest outbreak of ASF that we've had. Really, the only country to this point that has been able to do that has been the Czech Republic. So I would like to see Philippines next. But please do contact me and let me know how it's going. That would help me with an upcoming panel that I'm part of. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so let me just read the synthesis of our lectures for this second day of our PPC. Okay, so first, Dr. Goodall started with a living with ASF. So we need to identify what is our goal, which is to produce. Consequently, the necessity to know what impacts and how it impacts the performance of our operations. She also emphasized while laboratory or serology remain very important, focusing on monitoring performances resulted to better efficiency. In measuring performance, she recommended to create a visual monitoring tool in documentation and communicate effective visual. Speaker number 2, Mr. Frio, emphasized that now is the golden opportunity to build our future. The future starts in preparing gilts. In preparing gilts, focusing on nutrition is crucial in attaining fertility and targets. Speaker number 3, Dr. Abelilia Messina, zoomed in into the importance of feed and water as vector of diseases in piglets. She provided studies on tools to help reduce the risks from these vectors. And she also talked about currently available nutritional tools, including emerging technologies that could be available in the near future. Speaker number 4, Dr. Bonto, dissected occurrences based on their serological surveys and data emphasizing on prevalence and seasonality of different diseases. Provided practical field case reports to learn from. And finally, Dr. Pyburn expounded about the importance of diagnostics, enumerating the different diagnostic tools and focusing on their uses and advantages.